The world is always moving, even when we think it's still, and somewhere in the quiet folds of a garden or a meadow or a sun-warmed patch of wild grasses, there is a creature waiting. It doesn't rush. It doesn't fidget. It simply holds its place in the architecture of green stems and trembling leaves, as if time itself has paused to admire the perfect stillness of its form. This is the mantis, a being so strange and so familiar all at once, with its long body folded like a question mark, its front legs raised in what looks like prayer or contemplation, though it is neither. It is something older than prayer, something written into the language of survival and patience and the slow turn of seasons. I find myself drawn to this insect, not because it is loud or bright or demanding of attention, but because it asks us to slow down, to notice what we might otherwise miss, to see the world through a lens of sigh, detail, and quiet wonder. The mantis belongs to an ancient order, Mantidae, a name that feels almost mythical when spoken aloud, and there are more than 2,000 species scattered across the continents, each one a variation on a theme of stillness and sudden motion, of camouflage and calculated strike. Some are green as new leaves, others brown as bark. Some wear colors that mimic flowers, petals and pistils rendered in chitin and patience, and all of them share that distinctive posture, those raptorial forelegs held close, waiting. If you've ever seen one, truly seen one, you know how it seems to look back at you, how its triangular head swivels on that improbable neck, tracking your movement with compound eyes that catch the light like polished stones. It is one of the few insects that can turn its head, can follow you with its gaze. And there's something unsettling and fascinating in that, something that blurs the line between the alien and the strangely knowing. But to understand the mantis, to really enter its world, we have to begin not with the watching, but with the making, not with the hunter we see poised on a leaf, but with the architecture of its body, the mechanics of its being, the way evolution has shaped every angle and joint for a singular purpose. The mantis is built for the ambush, every part of it a testament to waiting and seeing and striking with a speed that defies the eye. Its elongated thorax gives it reach, gives it the advantage of distance when it unfolds those forelegs in a motion too fast to follow. The femur and tibia of each foreleg lined with spines that interlock like the teeth of a trap, and once closed around prey, there is no escape, no wiggling free from that serrated grip. The head, that strange pivoting head, holds eyes that see in ways we can barely imagine, compound eyes made of thousands of tiny lenses, each one capturing a fragment of the world, a mosaic of light and shadow and movement, and between them, 3 simple eyes called ocelli, like small jewels set into the face, tracking changes in light, in the passage of time from dawn to dusk. And the antenna, thread-thin and sensitive, reading the air for chemical signals, for the scent of a mate or the presence of prey, for all the invisible information that drifts through the world unnoticed by us but vital to them. There is something almost delicate about the mantis when you look closely, something that contradicts its reputation as a fierce predator, the way its wings fold along its back when it has them, some species adorned with eye spots or patterns that startle would-be attackers, some with wings reduced to mere stubs, vestigial reminders of flight abandoned in favor of other strategies, But we're getting ahead of ourselves, because before there is the mantis we recognize, before there is the hunter on the leaf, there is something else entirely. There is the beginning, the egg, the ootheca. This is where every mantis starts, in a foam case constructed by its mother, a structure both architectural and organic, hardened into a protective shell that weathers the winter or the dry season, holding within it dozens, sometimes hundreds, of tiny potential lives. The ootheca is a marvel, a word that sounds medical or scientific, but describes something far more poetic. It is a foam nest, a cradle spun from the body of the female mantis in the final act of her life, or sometimes in the middle of it, depending on the species and the season and the urgency written into her genetic code. She creates it by secreting a protein-rich substance from glands in her abdomen, a liquid that froths and expands as it meets the air, and as she moves, as she carefully shapes it with specialized appendages, the foam begins to harden, forming chambers and corridors, tiny rooms where each egg will rest in its own protected space. The process can take hours, and watching it, if you're patient enough, if you're lucky enough to witness it, is like watching architecture emerge from nothing, from the pure intention of survival. She moves with such deliberate care, such precision, turning and sculpting. And when she's done, when the last egg is tucked away and the foam has set, she leaves it, sometimes on a twig, sometimes under the eave of a building, sometimes tucked into the bark of a tree or fastened to a fence post, and there it stays, this pale brown or tan or sometimes golden structure, no bigger than a walnut in some species, as large as a chicken egg in others. Inside the eggs wait, and this is where we must slow down even further, because the story of the mantis begins in this waiting, in this suspension of time, in the darkness of the ootheca, where tiny embryos develop at a pace dictated by temperature and moisture and the invisible clock of the seasons. In temperate regions, where winter comes with cold and frost, the eggs remain dormant, a state called diapause, where development pauses, where life holds its breath until the world warms again, and this can last for months, 5 or 6 or even 7 months of stillness, of potential held in abeyance. But in tropical regions where the rhythm is different, where wet and dry seasons replace the cycle of freeze and thaw, the eggs may hatch in just a few weeks, emerging into a world that is always green, always warm, always humming with the possibility of food and growth. The hatching itself, when it finally comes, is something extraordinary, something that seems impossible until you see it. The tiny nymphs, each one no larger than a grain of rice, begin to push their way out through exit holes in the ootheca, holes that were there all along, planned for, built into the architecture. They emerge covered in a thin membrane, a temporary skin, and they hang from threads of silk, dozens of them, sometimes hundreds, suspended like tiny acrobats below the case. And there they molt for the first time, shedding that initial covering, revealing the miniature mantis beneath, and they are perfect, already perfect, tiny replicas of the adults they will become, with the same triangular head, the same raptorial forelegs, the same watchful posture, but so small, so impossibly delicate, that a breath could blow them away, a raindrop could crush them. This is perhaps the most vulnerable moment in the life of a mantis. This emergence into a world that is suddenly vast and filled with danger. They have no mother to guide them. She is long gone. Or if she survived the laying, she takes no interest in her offspring. The mantis is solitary from the very beginning, each nymph an island unto itself, and so they scatter immediately, instinctively, climbing away from each other up stems and across leaves, because to stay together would be fatal. The mantis is a cannibal, even at birth, even when its siblings are the only other living things nearby. Hunger overrides kinship, and the first meal of many a young mantis is a brother or sister who moved too slowly, who failed to climb far enough, fast enough. This is the harsh mathematics of the mantis, from hundreds of eggs. Perhaps only a handful will survive to adulthood. Predation takes most, birds and lizards and spiders and other insects. And then there is starvation, the simple failure to find food in those critical early days when the body is growing and molting and demanding constant fuel. The young mantis, the nymph, looks like the adult but lacks wings. It is earthbound, or rather plant-bound, confined to the realm of stems and leaves and flowers, and it must eat, must hunt from the moment it can stand on its own legs. What does it hunt at this size when it is barely visible against the green? It hunts aphids, tiny flies, thrips, springtails, anything small and soft-bodied and slow enough to catch, and it hunts with the same method. It will use all its life, the ambush, the patient waiting, the explosive strike. Even at this size, the forelegs move faster than the human eye can follow. Studies have clocked the strike of a mantis at speeds between 30 and 50 milliseconds, from rest to capture, from stillness to violence, in less time than it takes to blink, and with each meal the nymph grows, but it cannot grow smoothly, cannot expand gradually like we do, because it is wrapped in an exoskeleton, a hard outer shell that does not stretch or give, and so it must molt, must shed its skin in a process that is both miraculous and perilous. Molting, or ecdysis, as the scientists call it, happens multiple times in the life of a mantis, anywhere from 5 to 10 times, depending on the species and the sex. Females typically undergo more molts than males, growing larger, becoming the formidable hunters we recognize. Before a molt, the nymph stops eating. Its body begins to produce a new soft exoskeleton beneath the old one, and hormones flood its system, triggering changes, preparing it for the transformation, and then, when the time is right, when the internal clock says now, it finds a secure perch, hangs upside down, and begins the slow work of splitting free. The old skin cracks along the back of the thorax, a seam opening like a door, and the mantis pulls itself out, pale and soft and vulnerable, its new exoskeleton still tender, still hardening in the air, and for hours, sometimes a full day, it cannot move properly, cannot hunt, cannot defend itself. It simply hangs and waits for its body to cure, for the chitin to harden and darken and become armor once again. Each molt brings changes, subtle shifts in proportion, in color, or in the development of wing buds that appear like small bumps on the back of older nymphs, promises of flight that will only be fulfilled in the final transformation, the molt into adulthood. But between molts, in the days and weeks of hunting and growing, the young mantis begins to reveal its character, begins to show the behaviors that will define it, the stillness, the patience, the uncanny ability to blend into its surroundings. Camouflage in the mantis is not just about color. though color matters, a green mantis on green leaves, a brown mantis on brown bark. But it's also about shape, about posture, about the way the insect holds itself to mimic a twig or a leaf stem or even a flower petal. Some species, the flower mantises, take this to an extreme. Their bodies flattened and lobed, colored in pinks and whites and purples, looking so much like orchid blooms or other blossoms that pollinators approach them, drawn in by the deception, and become meals instead of guests. Others, the bark mantises, are textured and ridged. Their bodies a map of false wood grain, complete with knobs and projections that break up their outline, that make them invisible to both predator and prey when they press themselves flat against a tree trunk. This is aggressive mimicry, a term that sounds almost violent but simply describes the use of disguise not to hide from danger, but to lure in food, the mantis as both artist and trap, painting itself into the landscape and waiting for the landscape to deliver what it needs. And what it needs is constant. The mantis is an obligate carnivore. It cannot eat plant matter, cannot survive on nectar or pollen like some insects do. It must have flesh, must have the proteins and fats found only in other living creatures. In the wild, a mantis might eat its own body weight in insects every few days during periods of active growth. Crickets, grasshoppers, moths, butterflies, beetles, flies, bees, wasps, despite their stings, even other mantises if the opportunity presents itself and hunger overrides caution. The menu is limited only by size. A mantis can take prey up to half again its own body length if it's bold. If it's hungry enough, there are documented cases of large females capturing small lizards, frogs, hummingbirds caught at feeders, though these are exceptions, outliers in a diet that is overwhelmingly insect. Each kill follows the same pattern, the same ancient choreography. The mantis positions itself, often swaying slightly, a movement that mimics wind-blown vegetation that keeps it looking like part of the plant rather than something alien perched upon it. The eyes track the prey, those compound eyes with their thousands of facets. And research has shown that mantises have binocular vision. They judge distance, calculate the trajectory, measure the gap between themselves and their target with remarkable accuracy. And then, when everything aligns, when the prey is close enough, unaware enough, the strike, those forelegs shoot forward, the spines interlock around the victim, and the mantis pulls its catch close, begins to eat, always starting with the head, disabling the prey's ability to fight or flee, consuming it methodically, piece by piece. There is no waste. A mantis will eat almost everything, leaving only the hardest parts, wing cases sometimes, the toughest bits of exoskeleton, and then it cleans itself, using its mouth and forelegs to groom away any remnants, restoring the perfect camouflage, the seamless disguise. This is the early life of the mantis, this cycle of hunting and eating and molting and growing, this solitary existence where every day is a test of skill and patience and the simple will to survive. And as the nymphs mature, as they move through their instars, the stages between molts, they begin to spread out, to claim territories, to establish themselves in the intricate hierarchy of the garden or the forest or the field. Some mantises are wanderers, moving from plant to plant as food becomes scarce or as they outgrow their hunting grounds. Others are anchors, finding a single bush or patch of vegetation and defending it, returning to the same perch day after day, learning every angle, every shadow, every place where prey might pass. Territory in the mantis world is not marked with scent or sound. It is claimed simply by presence, by occupation, and if two mantises of similar size encounter each other, the confrontation is usually brief, a display of raised forelegs, a swaying threat posture, and one, usually the smaller or the less confident, retreats. But sometimes, when food is abundant and space is generous, mantises will tolerate each other at a distance, coexisting in the same general area without conflict, each one focused on its own survival, its own patient vigil. As the nymphs grow larger, as they approach their final molts, something begins to change in their behavior, a restlessness, an awareness that extends beyond the immediate need for food. This is the stirring of reproduction, the biological imperative that will dominate the final phase of their lives. The transition to adulthood, that final molt, is the most dramatic, the most transformative, because this is when the wings appear fully formed and folded along the back, and for the first time, the mantis has the option of flight. Though not all species fly well, not all species fly at all, males are typically the stronger flyers, their bodies lighter, more streamlined, built for the risky journey of finding a mate. Females are heavier, their abdomens swollen with developing eggs even before mating occurs, and flight for them is often clumsy, short-lived, a last resort rather than a primary mode of travel. But the wings serve other purposes beyond locomotion. When threatened, many mantis species will suddenly spread their wings, revealing hidden colors, eye spots, startling patterns that can make a small insect look suddenly larger, suddenly dangerous, suddenly not worth the effort of attacking. Some species of palm, the ones living in drier climates, use their wings to create sound, rubbing them together or against their abdomen in a process called stridulation, producing clicks and hisses that warn away predators or communicate with potential mates. And now, as adults, the mantises begin the complex and often perilous dance of reproduction. And this is where the mantis reveals perhaps its most famous, most misunderstood behavior, sexual cannibalism. The consumption of the male by the female during or after mating is real, documented across many species, but it is neither universal nor inevitable. It happens, yes, but not always, not even in the majority of encounters in the wild. The story begins with the male, newly molted into adulthood, his instincts now focused entirely on finding a female. He uses his antennae to detect pheromones, chemical signals that drift on the air like invisible threads, leading him toward potential mates. And when he finds one, when he locates a female, he must approach with extraordinary caution. The female is larger, always larger, sometimes twice his size, and she is a predator. Her instinct is to strike at movement, to capture and consume anything that ventures too close, and the male is food-sized, perfectly within her prey range. So he approaches slowly, often from behind, using the same stealth he would use to hunt, freezing when she turns her head, waiting, advancing only when her attention is elsewhere. It can take hours, this careful approach, this game of patience and nerve. Sometimes he succeeds in mounting her without incident, climbing onto her back, positioning himself, And the mating itself is a delicate affair, the transfer of a spermatophore, a packet of sperm that the female will store and use to fertilize her eggs. And when it's complete, when the act is finished, the male dismounts and, if he's quick, if he's fortunate, he escapes. He may go on to mate again. Some males successfully mate with multiple females over their short adult lives, contributing their genetic material to hundreds or even thousands of offspring. But sometimes the female strikes, either during the approach, during the mating, or immediately after. Her forelegs snap forward. She catches him, and she begins to eat, starting with the head, just as she would with any prey. And here is the strange part, the part that has fascinated and horrified observers for decades. Even as she consumes his head, even as she devours his thorax, the male's abdomen continues the mating, continues the transfer of sperm, because the neural center controlling reproduction is not in the brain. It's in the abdominal ganglia. And removing the head, removing the inhibitions that the brain might impose, can actually enhance the mating process. From an evolutionary perspective, this makes a terrible kind of sense. If the male is going to die anyway, if his lifespan as an adult is measured in weeks rather than months, then providing nutrition to the female, ensuring that she has the resources to produce healthy eggs, to create robust offspring, might be the ultimate genetic investment. But in the wild, studies suggest that cannibalism occurs in perhaps 10 to 28% of mating encounters, far less than the popular imagination suggests. Factors that increase the likelihood include female hunger, lack of recent meals, and the clumsiness or inexperience of the male in his approach. In laboratory setting, where mantises are kept in small enclosures, where the male cannot escape even if he wanted to, the rate climbs dramatically, which is why early observations made in artificial conditions created an exaggerated sense of how common this behavior truly is. After mating, whether the male survives or not, the female's focus shifts entirely to feeding, to building the reserves she will need to produce her ootheca. She hunts with renewed intensity, her appetite seemingly endless, because inside her, eggs are developing, maturing, preparing for the moment when she will construct that foam cradle and deposit them into the world. The time between mating and egg-laying varies. Some species lay their ootheca within days. Others wait weeks, allowing the eggs to develop further internally before committing them to the external case. And a single female may produce multiple oothecae in her lifetime, anywhere from 1 to 6 or even more in species with longer adult lifespans. Each ootheca represents an enormous investment. The protein alone, the material needed to construct the case and fill it with eggs, requires that the female consume many times her body weight in prey, and this is why she must hunt so aggressively, why she cannot afford to be selective or cautious, why she will strike at almost anything that moves within range. And then, as autumn arrives in temperate zones, as the days shorten and temperatures drop, the adult mantises begin to slow. Their movements become sluggish, their hunting less precise. They are cold-blooded, ectothermic, their body temperature governed entirely by the environment. And when the environment turns cold, they turn cold with it. The first hard frost often marks the end. Females that have laid their eggs, males that have completed their mating, simply succumb to the cold. their bodies stiffening, falling from their perches, returning to the soil, to the cycle of decomposition and renewal. But before they die, before that final stillness, there is often a period of strange behavior, a wandering, a seeming disorientation. Some researchers believe they are searching for the perfect place to die. Others think it's simply the breakdown of a normal navigation as their systems fail. But there's something almost purposeful about it, the way they move through the landscape one last time. In tropical regions where winter never comes, the pattern is different. Mantises can live longer, some species surviving 6 months or more as adults, breeding multiple times, producing generation after generation without the enforced pause of winter, and competition becomes fiercer, territories more valuable, the strategies for survival more complex. Throughout all of this, so throughout the entire life cycle from egg to nymph to adult, the mantis remains what it has always been, a creature of patience and precision, a hunter that relies not on speed or strength in the conventional sense, but on stillness, on the ability to wait, to watch, to strike at the exact right moment. Its senses are tuned to detect the slightest movement. Experiments have shown that mantises can see prey moving from up to 20 meters away in good light. Their compound eyes are particularly sensitive to motion, to changes in the visual field, while stationary objects, even potential food items, often go unnoticed. The mantis also has remarkable depth perception, rare among insects. Achieved through a kind of stereoscopic vision, each compound eye sees a slightly different image, and the brain, small as it is, processes these images to calculate distance, to judge the precise gap between itself and its target. Recent research has revealed even more sophisticated visual processing. Mantises can detect differences in shading that indicate three-dimensional form. They can distinguish between objects based on their movement patterns, and they can even perceive a rudimentary form of color, though their color vision is quite different from ours, shifted toward the ultraviolet end of the spectrum where many flowers and insects reflect in patterns invisible to human eyes. This visual acuity is paired with exceptionally fast reflexes. The neural pathways from eye to muscle are short, direct, optimized for speed, and the mantis can adjust its strike mid-motion, correcting for prey that dodges or changes direction, a level of coordination that speaks to millions of years of evolutionary refinement. But vision is not the only sense at work. The antennae, those delicate thread-like structure, are covered in chemoreceptors, cells that detect specific molecules, pheromones that signal the presence of mates, alarm chemicals released by disturbed prey, even the subtle sense that might indicate predators nearby. Touch, too, plays a role in the mantis's world, though it is harder for us to imagine. Mechanoreceptors scattered across the exoskeleton detect vibrations, air currents, the brush of a leaf, or the footfall of an approaching predator. These sensory hairs, called setae, are so sensitive that some species can detect the wing beats of a bat, the ultrasonic pulses that bats use to navigate and hunt in darkness. And when a mantis hears those pulses, when those particular frequencies register through the specialized hearing organ located on its thorax, a single ear positioned between the middle and rear legs, it responds with evasive maneuvers, sudden drops, spiral dives if it's in flight, anything to escape the echolocation lock of a predator that hunts by sound. This is a relatively recent discovery. the mantis ear, found only in adults, only in species that fly at night when bats are active, a beautiful example of evolutionary adaptation, of survival through sensory awareness, of the constant arms race between predator and prey that has been running for millions upon millions of years. Because the mantis is old, ancient in the deep sense, fossils of mantis ancestors date back to the Cretaceous period, more than 100 million years ago, when dinosaurs still walked the earth and flowering plants were just beginning their explosive diversification across the continents. Those early mantises were different in some ways, smaller, perhaps, less specialized, but the fundamental body plan was already there. The raptorial forelegs, the elongated thorax, the hunting strategy of ambush and patience. These were innovations that worked so well that they have persisted, refined but not fundamentally altered, across vast spans of geological time. The fossil record shows mantises spreading, diversifying, adapting to different climates and vegetation types. Some species growing large, some staying small, some developing bizarre ornamentations and camouflages that speak to the incredible variety of ecological niches they came to occupy. Today, in our current epoch, the Holocene, mantises are found on every continent except Antarctica. From tropical rainforests, where humidity hangs thick and vegetation grows in layered canopies, to temperate woodlands and grasslands, to semi-arid scrublands where survival depends on extracting every possible advantage from a harsh environment. Each habitat has shaped its mantis inhabitants, has sculpted to them through the slow, patient work of natural selection. In rainforests, species tend toward greens and browns, mimicking leaves and bark in an environment where competition is fierce and predators are everywhere. Some have evolved to look like dead leaves, complete with brown coloration and irregular edges that suggest decay. In deserts and dry grasslands, mantises often take on colors of sand and dried vegetation, tans and grays and pale yellows, and they tend to be more active hunters, less willing to wait for prey to come to them, because prey is scarcer, more scattered, and energy must be conserved. In some parts of Africa and Asia, the flower mantises have reached the peak of their mimicry. Species like the orchid mantis, Hymenopus coronatus, are so convincing in their disguise that they don't just avoid detection. They actively attract pollinators, insects that land on them thinking they've found a blossom, only to be caught and consumed. This is evolutionary artistry, the mantis as both canvas and painter. Its body shaped by countless generations of selection for the traits that work, that allow survival, that lead to reproduction and the passing on of genes, and humans have noticed, have been fascinated by mantises for as long as we have kept records. In ancient Greece, the mantis was associated with prophecy, with seers and oracles, perhaps because of that watchful stillness, that sense of ancient knowing in the way it turns its head to observe. In China, the mantis appears in poetry and martial arts. The praying mantis style of kung fu, supposedly inspired by watching a mantis defend itself against a bird, using its forelegs to block and strike, to redirect force, to survive through technique rather than strength. In Japan, mantises are symbols of courage and vigilance, admired for their fearlessness despite their small size, their willingness to face threats much larger than themselves with raised forelegs and unwavering stance. European folklore is more mixed, some cultures seeing the mantis as good luck, a protector of crops through its consumption of pest insects, others viewing it with suspicion, its alien appearance and predatory nature inspiring unease. And in modern times, the mantis has found a new role as a biological control agent, farmers and gardeners deliberately introducing mantises into their fields and greenhouses, banking on the mantis's appetite to reduce populations of aphids, caterpillars, beetles, all the insects that feed on cultivated plants. The problem, though, is that the mantis is not selective. It doesn't distinguish between pest and pollinator, between harmful beetle and beneficial bee. It simply eats what it can catch. And so its effectiveness as a control agent is limited, helpful in some situations, counterproductive in others. Still, the presence of mantises in a garden is generally considered a sign of health, an indicator of biodiversity, of an ecosystem complex enough to support predators at multiple trophic levels, and many people now purchase Mantis othecae commercially, hanging them in their gardens, waiting for the spring hatch, releasing hundreds of tiny mantises into the world with the hope that some will stay, will establish themselves, will become permanent residents and hunters. The mantis has also found its way into laboratories, into research facilities where scientists study its vision, its neural processing, its biomechanics, because despite being an insect, despite having a brain smaller than a grain of rice, the mantis demonstrates capabilities that challenge our understanding of what's possible with such limited neural hardware. Studies of mantis vision have revealed principles that engineers now use in designing robot vision systems. The way mantises detect motion, calculate distance, predict trajectory, all with incredible efficiency, incredible speed, using neural circuits that are far simpler than anything in a vertebrate brain. Biomechanics researchers study the mantis strike, filming it with high-speed cameras, analyzing the muscle activation patterns, the joint mechanics, the energy storage and release, trying to understand how such explosive speed is achieved, how the mantis generates forces many times its body weight in a fraction of a second, and behavioral scientists observe mantis decision-making, the choices they make about when to strike and when to wait, how they assess risk versus reward, how they learn from experience, because mantises do learn, they can be trained, they remember, they adjust their behavior based on past encounters. All of this research has deepened our appreciation, has revealed the mantis as far more than just a simple predatory insect. It is a sophisticated organism, a product of deep evolutionary time, a survivor that has found ways to thrive in a changing world through flexibility, through specialization, through the perfection of a single strategy carried out with unwavering dedication. But for all the science, for all the study and observation and analysis, there remains something ineffable about the mantis, something that resists complete explanation. Perhaps it's that stillness, that quality of absolute presence, the way a mantis can sit motionless for hours, not sleeping, not resting, but actively waiting, actively watching, existing in a state of readiness that we humans, with our restless minds and constant motion, find difficult to comprehend, or perhaps it's the way they seem to look at us, that swiveling head, those dark eyes that catch and hold our gaze, creating a moment of connection across the vast evolutionary distance between mammal and insect, between us and them, a recognition, however brief, however illusory, that we share this world, that we are both trying in our different ways to survive, to persist, to find our place in the great web of life. As autumn deepens in the temperate zones, as the last adults lay their final oothacay and succumb to the cold. There is a pause, a holding of breath in the mantis year. The eggs rest in their foam cases, dormant, waiting for the trigger that will restart the cycle. And in that waiting, there is a kind of faith, not conscious, not deliberate, but encoded in the very structure of the ootheca, in the arrangement of the eggs, in the chemical signals that will tell them when spring has come. And spring always comes. The world turns, temperatures rise, and from those weathered cases, from oothecae that have endured months of freezing and thawing, of rain and snow and the patient work of time, new mantises emerge, beginning again, continuing the story that has been unfolding for 100 million years, that will unfold, we can hope, for 100 million more. Each generation faces the same challenges, the same threats from predators and parasites, from weather and chance, and the simple difficulty of finding enough food to grow, to molt, to reach adulthood and reproduce. And each generation meets those challenges with the same tools, the same instincts, the same patient, predatory grace. There is something humbling in this continuity, in the way the mantis persists, unchanged in its essentials, while the world around it transforms. Continents drift, climates shift, species rise and fall, and through it all, the mantis remains, waiting on its leaf, watching with ancient eyes, striking with timeless precision. We might ask ourselves what it means to be a mantis, not in the literal sense, not in the mechanical description of anatomy and behavior, but in the deeper sense, the experiential sense. What is it like to perceive the world through compound eyes, to feel through antennae, to know hunger as the only driving force beyond the urge to reproduce? The mantis has no concept of past or future, no memory of childhood, no anticipation of death. It exists entirely in the present moment, in the eternal now of sensory input and instinctive response. And there is something almost meditative about this, something that mirrors the practices humans develop to quiet the restless mind, to achieve presence, to simply be. When a mantis waits, it is not hoping, not wishing, not thinking about the meal it might catch. It is simply ready, poised in a state of perfect readiness, and the strike, when it comes without hesitation, without doubt, without the second-guessing that plagues creatures cursed with self-awareness. This is what we might call pure function, existence stripped to its essentials. And while we should resist the temptation to romanticize it, to project onto the mantis qualities it does not possess, there is still something to learn from observing this way of being, this absolute commitment to the moment, this fusion of patience and action. The mantis teaches us about timing, about the value of waiting for the right moment rather than forcing action prematurely, about the power of stillness as a strategy, not passive, not inactive, but alert, ready, conserving energy for the decisive instant when waiting transforms into striking. It teaches us about adaptation, about the importance of fitting into one's environment, not through domination, not through changing the world to suit oneself, but through becoming part of it, through camouflage and patience, through understanding the rhythms and patterns of the place where one lives. And it teaches us about efficiency, about doing one thing supremely well rather than many things adequately. The mantis is not a generalist. It does not scavenge or graze or adapt to whatever food source presents itself. It hunts, and it has refined hunting into an art form, into a practice honed over geological time until every element works in perfect concert. There is brutality in the mantis world. Yes, the cannibalism, the consumption of mates and siblings, the cold calculus of survival that leaves no room for sentiment. But there is also elegance, economy, a kind of terrible beauty in the perfection of form, following function. The raptorial forelegs are beautiful in their design, beautiful in the way a well-made tool is beautiful. Every spine positioned for maximum grip, every joint angled for optimal leverage, the whole assembly capable of moving faster than thought, faster than mercy, delivering death with a precision that is almost respectful in its efficiency. And the camouflage, the mimicry, these are artistry of a different kind, the slow, patient work of evolution painting each species into its habitat, adjusting colors, modifying shapes, adding details that fool the eye, that transform a living creature into a perfect replica of bark or leaf or flower. This is creativity without a creator, beauty without an artist, pattern emerging from the simple mathematics of survival and reproduction played out across millions of iterations. We see in the mantis a mirror of certain aspects of existence itself, the cycles of birth and death, the struggle for resources, the drive to reproduce, the inevitability of mortality. These are not unique to mantises. They are universal themes, written into the very fabric of life. But the mantis presents them with such clarity, such starkness, that they become almost philosophical lessons, koans of the natural world. What does it mean that the male sometimes sacrifices himself to feed the female, to ensure his offspring have the resources to develop? Is this altruism or simply genetic programming? And does the distinction matter? Does the mechanism diminish the outcome? The fact that life continues, that the next generation receives what it needs to begin its own journey? What does it mean that hundreds of siblings hatch together only to scatter immediately, to compete, to potentially consume one another? Is this cruelty or simply honesty? The world stripped of pretense, showing itself as it truly is, a place of limited resources where survival is earned, not given, where every meal is won through skill or luck, or the failure of something else to be skilled or lucky enough. These are not comfortable questions, but the mantis does not deal in comfort. It deals in reality, in the unvarnished truth of what it takes to persist, to endure, to transform from a microscopic egg into a creature capable of flight and reproduction and the continuation of the ancient lineage. And perhaps this is the final gift of observing the mantis. Not answers, but better questions, deeper questions about our own existence, our own strategies for survival, our own relationship with the natural world. Because we are not so different. We too are shaped by our environment, by the demands of survival, by the need to find food and shelter and mates. We too carry within us instincts millions of years old, responses programmed by the same evolutionary processes that created the mantis And while we have added layers of culture and consciousness, of language and abstract thought, the foundations remain. The ancient imperatives still drive us in ways we often fail to recognize. The Mantis reminds us that we are part of nature, not separate from it, not above it, but woven into the same vast tapestry of life, subject to the same laws, playing our role in the same great cycles of energy and matter flowing through ecosystems, through food webs, through the endless transformation of sunlight into life and life back into the elements from which it came. In watching the mantis, in truly seeing it, we practice a kind of attention that is increasingly rare in our distracted age. We slow down, we observe, we notice details we would otherwise miss, the way light catches on a wing, the slight sway that mimics wind, the sudden snap of the strike, the methodical cleaning after a meal. And in that attention, in that slow, careful observation, something shifts. The mantis stops being just an insect, just a predator, just a biological curiosity, and becomes instead a teacher, a window, a doorway into understanding something larger about the world and our place in it. This is what the naturalists have always known, what the patient watchers of birds and insects and all the small overlooked creatures understand, that there is wisdom in the wild, not the wisdom of words and concepts, but the wisdom of pattern and process, of systems that work, of strategies that have proven themselves over time scales that make human history look like a brief flicker. The mantis has survived ice ages and mass extinctions, has persisted through climate shifts and continental rearrangements, not through intelligence in the way we measure it, not through technology or planning, but through flexibility within a framework of specialization, through being perfectly adapted to fill a niche while remaining capable of slight variations, slight adjustments, as conditions change, and as we face our own era of rapid change, of shifting climates and altered ecosystems. Perhaps there is something to learn from this, from the mantis's combination of ancient pattern and adaptive variation, from its ability to be both constant and flexible, both committed to a strategy and capable of small adjustments that allow persistence in new conditions. But these are large thoughts, abstract thoughts, and the mantis itself is not abstract. It is concrete, specific, immediate. It is the green form on the rose bush outside your window, the brown shape on the oak tree in the park, the unexpected encounter that stops you mid-step, makes you pause, makes you look closer. And in that pause, in that moment of connection, something passes between you and this ancient creature. Not communication in any linguistic sense, but recognition, acknowledgement, a brief shared moment of existence in the same space, the same time, the same world. The mantis does not know you are watching, does not care. It continues its vigil, its patient hunting, its existence playing out according to patterns set down before your species, before your genus, before your entire evolutionary lineage branched away from the tree of life that would eventually produce primates and humans, and the capacity to stand and wonder at an insect. And then you move on, and the mantis remains, and somewhere in soil, or on a branch, or under an eave, and Othika waits, holding within it the promise of continuation, the seeds of next year's generation, the future already present, already patient, already prepared to wait as long as waiting takes. The light changes as the day progresses, as the sun arcs across the sky, and shadows shift, and temperatures rise and fall, and the mantis adjusts, turns slightly to follow the warmth, repositions to maintain its camouflage. Or perhaps it doesn't move at all. Perhaps it has found the perfect spot, the ideal perch, and there it will stay until hunger or danger or the approach of darkness compels a change. This is the rhythm of the mantis, this alternation between stillness and motion, between waiting and striking, between the slow, patient accumulation of days and the sudden, explosive moments that define success or failure, life or death, continuation or ending. And as evening comes, as the light softens and the world prepares for night, the mantis remains, a small presence in a vast landscape, insignificant from one perspective, infinitely significant from another, because in its survival, in its persistence, in its flawless execution of the ancient program written into its genes, it carries forward something irreplaceable, a thread in the great web, a note in the symphony, a word in the ongoing story of life on earth. The stars emerge, invisible to the mantis, but present nonetheless. The same stars that have watched over countless generations of mantises, that will watch over countless more, indifferent, eternal, marking time on a scale that makes even the mantis's 100-million-year lineage seem brief. And somewhere, a female lays her eggs, foam hardening in the cooling air, and somewhere else, a male completes his final mating, and somewhere else, an Uthaka from last year, missed by all the birds and parasites and random chances that claim most, waits quietly for spring. The world turns, the mantis waits, and in that waiting there is everything. There is the whole story, the whole meaning, the patient presence, the readiness, the acceptance of what is, the participation in the great flow of energy and life that connects all things, from the smallest bacterium to the largest whale, from the briefest mayfly to the oldest tree, and we, watching, learning, trying to understand, we are part of this too, fellow travelers on the same improbable journey, temporary coalescences of matter and energy, briefly aware, briefly capable of wonder, briefly able to see a mantis and recognize in it something profound, something worth our attention, worth our time, worth the slow, careful observation that reveals not just facts about an insect, but something about existence itself. The mantis asks nothing of us, expects nothing, continues regardless of whether we notice or understand. And in that independence, that self-sufficiency, that complete absorption in its own being, there is a kind of peace, a kind of completion, a reminder that life needs no justification beyond itself, no purpose beyond continuation, no meaning beyond the simple fact of being here, now, present, alive. I notice the forest first, the way silence gathers between the trees like something you could hold in your hands. And in that gathering quiet, there's a kind of attention, the sort that pulls you inward, not towards sleep, though that might come, but towards something older, something that has always lived in the space between what we know and what we cannot name, language. The word itself feels almost too small, like trying to cup water in your palms. It spills through, it reshapes itself, and yet we use it. We have always used it, long before we understood what it was we were doing. Tonight, I find myself thinking about this, about the way sounds become meaning, the way breath becomes words, and words become everything we have ever known. There's a particular quality to the air when you begin to notice these things. When you start paying attention to the architecture of thought itself, and I imagine, just for a moment, what it might have been like tens of thousands of years ago, when the first human voice shaped itself around an idea, around a need to share what was inside, to make the invisible visible. The darkness around me feels generous, patient, and in it I can almost hear echoes, not literal echoes, but something like them, the accumulated weight of every utterance, every whispered secret and shouted declaration, every lullaby and prayer and joke and argument that has ever moved through human lips. Linguistics, the study of this magnificent complexity. This thing we do without thinking, breathing and speaking and meaning all at once. It asks us to slow down, to look closely at what we've been doing all along, to see the patterns we've been weaving since before we knew we were weavers. And there's something deeply calming about this, about recognizing that we are all, every one of us, walking repositories of linguistic knowledge, that our tongues know things our minds have never formally learned, that we navigate grammatical structures more intricate than any cathedral without ever having seen the blueprints. I think about a child, in any time, in any place, listening, absorbing, building an entire system of communication from the sounds that float around them, and how this happens, how it has always happened, without textbooks or instruction manuals, just the patient accumulation of patterns, the slow recognition of how pieces fit together. The study of language, when you really enter into it, becomes a study of everything, because language touches everything. It's there in the way we remember, the way we dream, the way we organize reality into categories and concepts. It's the medium through which we inherit the thoughts of the dead and pass our own thoughts to the unborn. And tonight, in this quiet space, I want to trace some of these threads, to follow the long story of how we came to understand what language is and what it does, and how it works its particular magic. This isn't a history exactly, though history will move through it. And it isn't a lesson, though there are things here worth learning. It's more like a slow walk through a museum at closing time, when the crowds have gone, and you can stand before each display as long as you like, letting your attention settle, letting the details emerge from the dimness. The field of linguistics, as a formal discipline, as a named pursuit, is relatively young, but the questions it asks are ancient. People have always wondered about language, about its origins, about its diversity, about the relationship between words and world, between sound and sense, and there's a particular texture to these questions, a quality of infinite regression, because we use language to study language. We're inside the thing we're trying to see clearly, like trying to see your own eyes without a mirror. And yet, we've developed such remarkable ways of looking, such sophisticated instruments of attention. I imagine the earliest grammarians in ancient India, in classical Greece, in medieval Iceland, listening to their own languages with new ears, beginning to catalog, to classify, to notice the rules hiding inside what seemed like chaos, and how that noticing, that careful attention, was itself a kind of meditation, a way of honoring the mystery by mapping its contours. The landscape of language, if we could see it all at once, would stretch beyond any horizon. Thousands of languages, each one a complete universe of expression, each one solving the same fundamental problem, how to move meaning from one mind to another, but solving it in such wildly different ways. And we'll explore some of these these beautiful variations as we move forward. But for now, in this opening moment, I want us to just appreciate the vastness, the improbable richness of human linguistic diversity, because there's something profoundly soothing about knowing that while you and I might share a language, there are people right now in this same moment speaking in ways so different from our own that we couldn't even imagine the sounds without hearing them, using grammars that organize reality according to principles we've never encountered. And yet, all of it, all of these thousands of systems, they all work. They all accomplish the fundamental task of human communication. The night deepens around these thoughts, and I feel ready to begin the journey properly, to step into the long unfolding story of how we came to understand this thing we do, this speaking, this meaning-making, this most human of all human capacities. The story begins, as so many stories do, not with a single moment, but with a slow accumulation of attention, with people noticing, with the gradual recognition that language itself could be examined, could be understood as a system, as something with rules and patterns that existed whether we acknowledged them or not. In ancient India, is more than 2,000 years before the Common Era, there were scholars who listened to Sanskrit with extraordinary precision, who heard not just meaning but structure, not just communication but form, and they began to write down what they heard, to create grammars that cataloged every inflection, every modification, every subtle shift in sound that carried a shift in meaning. Panini, whose name we still speak with reverence, composed what might be the most elegant grammar ever written, sometime around the 4th century before the Common Era, a work called the Ashtadhyayi, which means simply 8 chapters. But within those chapters was contained a system so sophisticated, so economically brilliant, that modern linguists still marvel at its construction. He didn't write in sentences as we might expect, but in sutras, compressed formulas, each one a kind of seed from which understanding could grow. And these sutras described Sanskrit with such precision that if you understood the system, you could generate any grammatically correct Sanskrit utterance and recognize any deviation from correctness. This wasn't just description. It was something deeper. It was the recognition that beneath the surface variety of speech, there existed rules, consistent principles, and that these principles could be made explicit, could be taught, could be preserved. The motivation was partly spiritual, partly practical. The Vedic texts were sacred, and they needed to be transmitted with perfect accuracy. Every sound mattered, every accent and duration and aspiration, because the power of the mantras resided not just in their meaning, but in their exact phonetic form. So the ancient Indian grammarians developed a science of sound, phonetics, before it was called phonetics. They mapped the positions of the tongue, the movements of the lips, the engagement of the vocal cords. They understood voiced and voiceless consonants, aspirated and unaspirated. They knew about places of articulation in the mouth, and they organized this knowledge into systematic classifications. And there's something almost musical about this attention, this loving precision, the way they listened to language as a musician might listen to a composition, hearing not just the notes, but the relationships between notes, the patterns that gave structure to sound. Meanwhile, in another part of the ancient world, Greek philosophers were asking different questions about language, questions about its relationship to reality, about whether words were natural or conventional, whether the connection between a sound and its meaning was arbitrary or somehow essential. Plato, in his dialogue Cratylus, explored this tension, presenting arguments on both sides. One character suggesting that names are natural, that they somehow capture the essence of what they name. Another arguing that names are merely conventional, agreed upon labels that could just as easily be otherwise. And Plato left the question beautifully unresolved, hanging in the air like an invitation to keep thinking. Aristotle, with his systematic mind, his drive to categorize and classify, began to develop concepts that would shape linguistic thinking for millennia. He identified parts of speech, noun and verb. He thought about tense and case, about the relationship between language and logic, about how statements could be true or false, how premises could lead to conclusions. His work wasn't primarily about language. It was about thought, about reasoning, about the structure of knowledge. But language was the medium through which thought moved. And so understanding language became necessary for understanding thought itself. The Greeks gave us the word grammar from grammatic, techne, the art of letters, and they began to codify the rules of Greek to describe its structure, though their descriptions were often tangled up with prescriptions, with ideas about how language should be rather than simply how it was. Centuries passed, and the Roman grammarians built on Greek foundations, Donatus and Priscian, names that echo through the history of education, wrote Latin grammars that would be copied and studied for more than 1,000 years, their work becoming the template through which medieval Europe understood language itself. But these ancient grammarians, sophisticated as they were primarily concerned with particular languages, with Sanskrit or Greek or Latin. They didn't yet have the comparative perspective, the recognition that studying many languages together might reveal something about language in general, about the human capacity for speech itself. That comparative vision, that broader perspective, would take time to develop, would require contact between cultures, the collision and mixing of linguistic communities, the slow accumulation of knowledge about just how differently human languages could be structured. In medieval Iceland, the first grammatical treatise, written by an unknown author in the 12th century, showed remarkable phonological insight. The author had studied Latin grammar, but recognized that Icelandic had sounds that Latin didn't, and rather than forcing Icelandic into Latin categories, he developed new symbols, new ways of representing the distinctive sounds of his own language. This was a kind of linguistic independence, a recognition that each language had its own integrity, its own system, and that understanding required flexibility, required meeting the language on its own terms, rather than imposing foreign categories. The medieval period saw the rise of speculative grammarians, the modistes, who believed that grammar reflected the structure of reality, that there was a universal grammar underlying all languages, a common logical framework. They were wrong in many of their specifics, but the impulse toward universals, toward finding what all languages share, that impulse would return again and again in linguistic thought. And then, gradually, Europe began to wake to the diversity of world languages. Explorers and missionaries encountered languages utterly unlike Latin or Greek, languages that seemed to organize reality differently, that had grammatical categories European languages lacked, that lacked categories European languages took for granted. The age of exploration, for all its violence and exploitation, its colonial horror, did bring languages into contact, did force European scholars to confront linguistic structures they had never imagined, Nahuatl and Quechua, Tamil and Tagalog, languages that couldn't be understood through Greco-Roman grammatical frameworks, that demanded new approaches, new tools of description. Missionaries learning indigenous languages to convert souls often became, almost inadvertently, documenters of linguistic diversity. They wrote grammars and dictionaries. They tried to map these strange new sound systems onto familiar alphabets. And in doing so, they preserved records of languages that would later vanish or transform beyond recognition. But still, the study of language remained fragmented, scattered across different traditions, different purposes. There wasn't yet a unified field, a discipline that studied language for its own sake, that asked systematic questions about how language worked, how it changed, how it was acquired, how it related to mind and culture and society. The 18th century brought new currents of thought, the Enlightenment's faith in reason, in systematic inquiry, in the possibility of understanding nature through observation and classification, and language as a natural phenomenon, as a human universal, began to attract this systematic attention. Scholars began to notice striking similarities between languages separated by vast distances, between Sanskrit and Latin and Greek, between Persian and the Germanic languages, patterns of correspondence that seemed too regular to be accidental, that suggested some kind of historical connection, some common ancestry. Sir William Jones, a British judge working in India in the late 1700s, made an observation that would transform linguistic study. He noticed that Sanskrit bore a striking resemblance to Greek and Latin, not just in vocabulary, but in grammatical structure, in the very architecture of the language. And he suggested in a lecture delivered in 1786 that these languages must have sprung from a common source, perhaps no longer existing. This was the birth, or perhaps the articulation, of comparative linguistics, the recognition that languages were related, that they formed families, that they evolved and changed over time according to regular principles, and that by comparing languages carefully, by identifying systematic correspondences, scholars could reconstruct linguistic prehistory, could trace the branching paths by which modern languages descended from ancient ancestors. The early 1800s saw an explosion of comparative work. Scholars like Rasmus Rask and Franz Bopp and Jacob Grimm, the same Grimm who would later collect fairy tales, they began to work out the regular sound correspondences between related languages to show that when Latin had a PA sound, Germanic languages often had an F, that these weren't random variations, but systematic shifts, sound laws that operated with almost mathematical regularity. Jacob Grimm formulated what came to be known as Grimm's Law, describing a pattern of consonant shifts that had occurred in the Germanic languages, showing how Proto-Indo-European stops had systematically shifted, how you could predict what sound would appear in one language based on what appeared in another. And this regularity, this law-like behavior suggested that language change wasn't chaotic, wasn't arbitrary, but followed principles that could be discovered and described. The neo-grammarians, Die Junggrammatiker, a group of German scholars in the late 1800s, pushed this insight to its extreme. They insisted that sound laws admitted no exceptions, that if a sound change occurred, it occurred everywhere in the language, in every word that met the right conditions, and that apparent exceptions must be explained by other factors, by analogy or borrowing or some other systematic process. This was a radical position, one that treated linguistic change as a natural science, subject to laws as regular as those governing physics or chemistry. And while the strictest version of this view would later be modified, softened, the fundamental insight remained that language change was systematic, that it could be studied scientifically, that history left traceable patterns in the structure of language. And this systematic approach, this scientific rigor, opened doors that had been closed for centuries. Suddenly, language wasn't just a tool for communication or a repository of culture or a marker of identity. It was also a natural phenomenon, something that could be studied with the same methods used to study geology or biology, something with its own patterns and principles and history. The reconstruction of Proto-Indo-European, the hypothetical ancestor of Sanskrit and Greek and Latin and Persian and Celtic and Germanic and Slavic and dozens of other language families, became a great collaborative project of 19th century scholarship. Scholars working backwards from known languages, comparing vocabularies, identifying sound correspondences, slowly piecing together a language that had never been written down, that had vanished millennia before writing reached the people who spoke it. They reconstructed not just sounds but words, not just words but meanings. They could say with reasonable confidence that the speakers of Proto-Indo-European had a word for father, for mother, for brother and sister and daughter and son. They had words for animals, for horse and cow and sheep and wolf. They had words for natural phenomena, for snow and star and moon and sun. And from these reconstructed vocabularies, scholars tried to imagine where these people had lived, what their culture had been like, what animals and plants and landscapes they had known. This was linguistic paleontology, recovering vanished worlds from the traces left in living speech, and it carried a certain poetry, a certain romance, the idea that every word we speak connects us to speakers long dead, that language is a kind of time machine, carrying ancient patterns forward into the present. But even as comparative linguistics flourished, as Indo-European studies dominated the field, there were scholars asking different questions. Questions not about historical relationships, but about synchronic structure, about how languages worked as systems at a given moment in time, regardless of their history or origins. Ferdinand de Saussure, a Swiss linguist working at the turn of the 20th century, would fundamentally reorient the field, though ironically his most influential work wasn't published until after his death, compiled from students' lecture notes, assembled into a book called The Course in General Linguistics. Saussure made a crucial distinction between langue and parole, between language as an abstract system the set of rules and patterns shared by a community, and language is actual speech, the concrete utterances produced by individuals. And he argued that linguistics should focus primarily on the system, because that's what speakers actually know. That's what makes communication possible. He also distinguished between synchronic and diachronic study, between analyzing language at a single point in time and tracing its historical development. And while both were valuable, he suggested that synchronic analysis was logically prior. You needed to understand how a language system worked before you could meaningfully study how it changed. Perhaps most importantly, Saussure articulated the principle that the linguistic sign, the connection between sound and meaning, between what he called the signifier and the signified, was fundamentally arbitrary. There's no natural reason why the sound tree should mean tree, or why arbre should mean the same thing in French, or Baum in German. The connection is conventional, established by social agreement, maintained by community practice. This arbitrariness, this conventionality, was crucial because it meant that language was a self-contained system, a structure of relationships, where each element derived its value not from any external reference, but from its position within the system, from its differences from other elements. A word meant what it meant, not because of any inherent connection between sound and sense, but because it wasn't other words, because it occupied a particular position in a network of contrasts and oppositions. Big means what it means partly because it isn't small, hot because it isn't cold. Language was a system of differences, of values created through relationship and opposition. This structuralist insight, this way of thinking about language as system rather than substance, would ripple out far beyond linguistics. It would influence anthropology and literary criticism, psychology and philosophy. It would become one of the defining intellectual movements of the 20th century, but at its heart, it was an insight about language, about how meaning emerges from structure, from pattern, from the elegant architecture of differences. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, American linguists were developing their own approaches, shaped by their own intellectual contexts and practical challenges. Franz Boas, an anthropologist working with indigenous languages of North America, emphasized the need to describe each language on its own terms, to resist the temptation to impose familiar categories from European languages onto radically different systems. He and his students, Edward Sapir and Leonard Bloomfield and others, documented languages that were vanishing, that were threatened by colonization and forced assimilation, and in documenting them, they encountered grammatical structures that challenged every assumption about what language could be. Languages with noun classes based on shape or animacy rather than gender. Languages where the verb carried information about the shape or consistency of its object. Languages with evidential markers that specified how the speaker knew what they were claiming, whether through direct perception or inference or hearsay. Grammatical distinctions that English simply didn't make, that English speakers didn't even think to make. Sapir, with his poet's sensibility, his feeling for the aesthetic dimensions of language, wrote about linguistic relativity, about the possibility that the language you speak shapes how you think, how you perceive, how you carve up the continuous flow of experience into discrete categories. His student Benjamin Lee Whorf would develop this idea further, though often in ways Sapir himself might not have endorsed. The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, as it came to be known, suggested in its strongest form that language determines thought, that speakers of different languages literally inhabit different cognitive worlds. And while this strong version has been largely rejected, there's still fascinating research on weaker forms, on how language might influence rather than determine, might make certain thoughts easier or harder, might direct attention in particular ways. Bloomfield, taking a very different approach, tried to make linguistics rigorously scientific, to base it on observable behavior rather than introspection or intuition. His approach, called structural linguistics, or sometimes American descriptivism, focused on distribution, on what elements could appear where, on the patterns of combination that defined grammatical structure. He wanted linguistics to be objective, empirical, free from mentalism, from appeals to meaning or intention or mental states. And while this behaviorist framework would eventually be challenged, the descriptive techniques Bloomfield developed, the careful attention to phonological and morphological patterns, the systematic methods for analyzing linguistic structure, these became fundamental tools of the field. The mid-20th century brought another revolution, another fundamental reorientation of how linguists thought about their subject. And this revolution came from an unexpected source, a young scholar at MIT trained in mathematics and logic, whose work would transform not just linguistics but cognitive science more broadly. Noam Chomsky, in a review published in 1959, systematically dismantled the behaviorist approach to language, arguing that language acquisition couldn't be explained by stimulus and response, by reinforcement and conditioning, because children produced sentences they'd never heard, because they extracted rules from limited input, because the linguistic knowledge they developed was far richer than the evidence available to them. This was the poverty of the stimulus argument, the observation that what children learn about language vastly exceeds what they could logically derive from the examples they hear. And Chomsky's solution was to propose that humans are born with an innate language faculty, a universal grammar, a set of principles and parameters that constrain and guide language acquisition. Language, in this view, wasn't learned the way you might learn to ride a bicycle or memorize multiplication tables. It was grown, developed, triggered by exposure to a particular linguistic environment. Children didn't need to be taught grammar. They already knew it. Deep down, they just needed to figure out which specific language they were hearing, which parameter settings applied to their particular linguistic community. This nativist position, this emphasis on innate biological endowment, sparked fierce debates that continue to this day, but it also opened up new research programs, new questions about what exactly was innate, about how universal grammar might be instantiated in the brain, about the relationship between language and other cognitive capacities. Chomsky's technical contributions were equally revolutionary. He developed formal theories of syntax, transformational grammar, phrase structure rules, the distinction between deep structure and surface structure, ways of representing the hierarchical organization of sentences, the relationships between elements that might be far apart on the surface, but closely connected in underlying structure. He showed that you could have sentences with the same surface form, but different underlying structures, like John is eager to please and John is easy to please, where John is the one doing the pleasing in the first, but receiving it in the second. And he showed that understanding these sentences required access to abstract structural relationships that went beyond the linear sequence of words. The Chomskyan revolution, as it's often called, made linguistics more formal, more mathematical, more focused on competence rather than performance, on the abstract knowledge that underlies linguistic ability rather than the messy details of actual language use. And while this approach had its critics, while many felt it neglected important aspects of language, its social dimensions, its variation, its use in real communicative contexts, it undeniably energized the field, attracted brilliant minds from mathematics and philosophy and computer science, turned linguistics into a hub of cognitive science. The late 20th century saw linguistics fragment into subfields, into specializations. Phonology studying sound systems, morphology studying word structure, syntax studying sentence structure, semantics studying meaning, pragmatics studying language use in context, sociolinguistics studying variation and change, psycholinguistics studying acquisition and processing, neurolinguistics studying the brain basis of language, computational linguistics developing algorithms and models. Each subfield developed its own methods, its own theoretical frameworks, its own debates and controversies. But they all shared a common subject, this extraordinary human capacity, this ability to map sounds to meanings, to combine elements in endlessly creative ways, to communicate thoughts and feelings and ideas with remarkable precision and flexibility. And researchers discovered, again and again, that language was more complex than anyone had imagined, that even the simplest utterance involved intricate coordination of perceptual and motor and cognitive systems, that children acquiring language were solving computational problems of staggering difficulty, that the human brain had specialized regions and circuits dedicated to linguistic processing, that damage to specific areas could produce specific linguistic deficits, aphasia that affected grammar but spared vocabulary, or vocabulary but spared grammar. The study of signed languages, languages that use gesture rather than sound, revealed that the human language capacity wasn't tied to any particular modality, that deaf communities developed fully complex languages with all the grammatical sophistication of spoken languages, organized in space rather than time, and that children exposed to signed languages acquired them in the same stages with the same ease as hearing children acquired spoken languages. This expanded the very definition of language, showed that what mattered wasn't sound, wasn't the vocal tract, but rather the abstract principles of combination and structure, the ability to map form to meaning, to create unlimited expressions from limited means. The closing decades of the 20th century brought an increasing awareness of linguistic diversity as both a scientific treasure and a fragile resource. Researchers began to document just how many languages existed in the world, how they were distributed, how many speakers each had, and the numbers were staggering, somewhere between 6,000 and 7,000 languages, spoken by 7 billion people, an almost unimaginable variety of ways that human communities had solved the problem of communication. But alongside this documentation came a darker realization that languages were disappearing at an alarming rate, that globalization and urbanization and political pressure were leading speakers to abandon their ancestral languages, to shift to dominant regional or national languages, and that at current rates, half of the world's languages might vanish by the end of the 21st century, taking with them unique ways of organizing experience, unique stores of cultural knowledge, unique solutions to the puzzle of how to speak. This sparked urgent efforts at language documentation. Linguists working with communities to record endangered languages, to create grammars and dictionaries, to develop writing systems where none existed, to preserve at least some record of languages that might soon have no living speakers. And this work brought linguists into closer contact with communities, raised questions about who owns language, who has the right to study it, how linguistic research could serve rather than exploit the people whose languages were being documented. The field began to reckon with its colonial past, with the ways that language study had sometimes been complicit in cultural destruction, with how missionaries and administrators had used linguistic knowledge to facilitate control and conversion, and a new ethic emerged, one that emphasized collaboration, that respected community ownership of linguistic knowledge, that saw language documentation not as extraction, but as partnership. At the same time, technology was transforming what was possible in linguistic research. Computers allowed for the analysis of a massive corpora, collections of texts or transcripts, revealing patterns that would have been invisible to researchers working with small samples, showing how frequently particular words or constructions appeared, in what contexts, with what collocations and associations, speech recognition and synthesis, machine translation, natural language processing. These computational applications both drew on and contributed to theoretical linguistics. They required explicit formal models, precise specifications of grammatical rules, and they revealed the extraordinary difficulty of tasks that humans performed effortlessly, the contextual knowledge, the pragmatic inference, the handling of ambiguity that underlies even simple conversation, the dream of machine translation, dating back to the early days of computing, had proven far more difficult than anyone expected. Early systems produced famously garbled translations. And it became clear that translating between languages required not just matching words, but understanding meaning. Not just applying rules, but grasping context. Not just processing syntax, but interpreting intention. But gradually, with the development of statistical approaches, and later neural networks and deep learning, machine translation improved. Systems that learned the patterns from vast amounts of translated text, that didn't rely on hand-coded rules but discovered regularities through exposure to examples. And while these systems still made errors, still missed nuances, still struggled with idioms and cultural references, they demonstrated that some aspects of linguistic knowledge could be extracted from data, could emerge from pattern recognition rather than explicit instruction. Neuroscience contributed new tools and new perspectives. Brain imaging technologies, fMRI and PET scans, and EEG, allowing researchers to observe the living brain as it processed language, to identify regions that activated during speech production or comprehension, to track the millisecond by millisecond unfolding of linguistic processing. Researchers found that language wasn't localized to a single area, but distributed across networks, that Broca's area and Wernicke's area, The classical language regions identified from 19th century lesion studies were part of larger circuits that processing grammar and processing meaning recruited overlapping but distinguishable neural systems, that the brain's response to linguistic violations, to sentences that broke grammatical rules, showed distinctive electrical signatures. The study of bilingualism revealed remarkable plasticity, showed that the brain could maintain multiple language systems, could switch between them flexibly, that learning a second language changed neural structure, and that these changes depended on age of acquisition, on proficiency, on how the languages were used, challenging earlier assumptions about critical periods and native-like attainment. Evolutionary linguistics emerged as a vibrant field, asking how language evolved, what precursors existed in other species, what genetic changes might have enabled human linguistic capacity. And while many questions remained deeply controversial, while the evidence was necessarily fragmentary, researchers made progress on understanding the evolutionary context, the selective pressures, the cognitive prerequisites that had to be in place before language could emerge. Studies of animal communication, of birdsong and whale song, of primate calls and bee dances revealed sophisticated systems, but none with the full combinatorial power of human language, none with the same recursive structure, the ability to embed phrases within phrases, to generate unlimited novel expressions from finite means. And this suggested that while many animals communicated, while many had signals and calls and displays, language as humans practiced it was genuinely unique, the product of specific evolutionary innovations. The FOXP2 gene, discovered through the study of a family with severe speech and language difficulties, provided the first concrete link between genetics and language. Mutations in this gene disrupted the ability to coordinate the fine motor movements required for speech, and comparative studies showed that the human version of FOXP2 differed from that in other primates, that these differences had arisen relatively recently in evolutionary time, though the gene itself was ancient, involved in many aspects of development, not a language gene in any simple sense, but one piece of the complex genetic architecture underlying linguistic ability. Fieldwork continued. Linguists traveling to remote regions, documenting languages spoken by small communities, and these descriptions revealed again and again how inadequate our theoretical frameworks were, how they'd been shaped by the familiar languages of Europe and Asia, how they struggled to account for the full range of human linguistic diversity. Languages with objects that preceded verbs, with verbs that came at the very end of sentences, languages with no clear distinction between nouns and verbs, languages with elaborate systems of classifiers, of evidentials, of tense and aspect markings that tracked information European languages ignored, languages that incorporated gestures as grammatical elements, that used iconicity, direct resemblance between form and meaning, in ways that challenged Saussure's principle of arbitrariness. Researchers working on these languages developed new theoretical frameworks, new ways of thinking about universals and variation, some arguing that diversity was so profound that the search for universal grammar was misguided, that languages were fundamentally different systems, shaped by history and culture and communicative needs. Others arguing that beneath surface diversity there were indeed deep commonalities, but that these commonalities were more abstract, more flexible than earlier theories had proposed. The field fractured into schools, into competing approaches: Chomskyan generative grammar, cognitive linguistics, construction grammar, functional typology, each with its own assumptions, its own methodologies, its own journals and conferences and training programs. And while this fragmentation sometimes felt divisive, it also reflected vitality, the existence of multiple productive research programs, multiple ways of asking questions about language, and through all these developments, all these theoretical debates and technical advances, there remained something fundamentally mysterious about language, something that resisted complete explanation. The fact that every neurologically typical child exposed to language acquired it, that they did so rapidly, effortlessly, without formal instruction, that they became fluent speakers of systems of immense complexity, that they could produce and comprehend sentences they'd never encountered before, that they could use language not just to communicate, but to think, to plan, to remember, to imagine. Researchers studied language acquisition in increasingly fine detail, tracking children's early vocalizations, their first words, their explosion into multi-word utterances, their mastery of grammatical morphemes, their growing ability to handle complex syntax, and they found remarkable regularities, stages that children passed through, errors that were systematic rather than random, over-regularizations where children applied rules too broadly, saying goed instead of went, revealing that they were extracting patterns, forming hypotheses, actively constructing grammar rather than passively absorbing it. But they also found variation, individual differences in pace and style, in whether children began with hollow phrases, single words standing for whole meanings, or with telegraphic multi-word combinations, differences that correlated with temperament, with environment, with the linguistic input children received, showing that while the broad trajectory was universal, the details were shaped by individual and cultural factors. The study of language disorders, of specific language impairment, of dyslexia, of autism spectrum conditions and their variable impact on linguistic development, revealed dissociations, cases where linguistic abilities were impaired while other cognitive capacities were intact, or where language developed normally despite cognitive impairments in other domains. And these dissociations supported the idea that language was in some sense modular, a distinct system with its own neural basis and developmental trajectory. Sociolinguistics flourished, documenting the social stratification of linguistic variation, how pronunciation and grammar and vocabulary varied by class, by region, by ethnicity, by gender, by age, showing that language wasn't uniform even within a single community, that speakers commanded multiple varieties, that they shifted between them depending on context, on audience, on the identity they wanted to project. William Labov's work on sound change in progress, tracking how vowel pronunciations were shifting in real time in American cities, demonstrated that language change was observable, measurable, that it followed social patterns, spreading through networks, led by particular demographic groups, and that speakers weren't consciously aware of most of these changes. They were happening below the level of explicit attention, driven by social dynamics rather than deliberate choice. The recognition that all languages and dialects were equally valid as linguistic systems, that non-standard varieties weren't corrupted or degraded forms, but legitimate varieties with their own rules and structures, helped challenge linguistic prejudice, the way that dialects were used to discriminate, to deny opportunities, to mark speakers as uneducated or unintelligent, though this recognition in academic linguistics hasn't always translated to broader social acceptance. And as the 21st century began, as new technologies emerged, social media and messaging apps and voice assistants, language adapted, new forms of written communication developed, blending features of speech and writing, creating novel conventions, acronyms and emoji and reaction GIFs, ways of conveying tone and emotion in text. And linguists studied these innovations, these rapid changes, seeing in them the same creative impulses, the same drive to communicate effectively that had always characterized human language use. The field today is vast, multifaceted, drawing on insights from psychology and neuroscience, from anthropology and computer science, from philosophy and education, asking questions at every level of organization, from the physics of speech sounds to the social dynamics of language communities, from the neural basis of grammar to the cultural construction of meaning. And yet, for all we've learned, for all the sophisticated theories and detailed descriptions, for all the brain scans and corpus analyses and computational models, language retains its essential mystery, its quality of being both utterly familiar and deeply strange, something we do without thinking but cannot fully explain, something that feels natural, effortless, but involves computational processes of staggering complexity. Perhaps this is part of what draws people to the study of language, the way it sits at the intersection of so many domains, neither purely biological nor purely cultural, neither completely universal nor entirely variable, a human capacity that is both ordinary, something every community possesses, and extraordinary, something that sets us apart from every other species, that makes possible everything we think of as distinctively human, art and science and history and philosophy, all of it mediated through language, all of it dependent on our ability to mean, to share, to speak. The thing about language, when you really sit with it, when you let yourself feel the strangeness of what we're doing right now, this moment, where marks on a screen or sounds in the air carry thought from one consciousness to another, is that it's almost impossible to believe, and yet we do it constantly, continuously, without marveling, without pausing to appreciate the improbability of it all. Every word is a miracle of shared convention, of collective agreement, thousands or millions of speakers somehow coordinating, maintaining a stable enough system that we can understand each other, but flexible enough that the system can change, can adapt, can incorporate new meanings, new forms, new ways of expressing what needs to be expressed. And beneath the words, there are the sounds, the phonemes, the minimal units that distinguish meaning. And what counts as a phoneme in one language might be a mere variation in another, might not be heard as meaningful. Speakers of Japanese struggling to hear the difference between R and L, speakers of English unable to distinguish the tones that carry meaning in Mandarin or Thai or Yoruba. Our perceptual systems tuned by early exposure, shaped by the particular language we encountered as infants. This raises profound questions about perception itself, about whether we hear what's there or what we expect, whether the categories we've learned impose themselves on experience, create boundaries where the physical signal is continuous, and research suggests both that categorical perception is real, that we do hear phonemes as distinct, but that the categories themselves are learned, constructed through exposure, through the statistical regularities of the language around us. Consider tone languages where the same sequence of consonants and vowels can mean entirely different things depending on whether the pitch rises or falls, or remains level, or dips and rises. And speakers of these languages hear tone as naturally as English speakers hear the difference between bit and bat. It's part of the word, inseparable from its identity. Yet speakers of non-tonal languages often struggle to perceive these distinctions, to reproduce them, to remember them, or consider grammatical gender, how German assigns der Mond, the moon, to masculine gender, while die Sonne, the sun, is feminine. But Spanish does the opposite, el sol, la luna, and French agrees with Spanish, le soleil, la lune, and none of these assignments reflect anything about the objects themselves. They're arbitrary, conventional, yet native speakers feel them as natural, as somehow right. Studies have shown that grammatical gender can influence thought in subtle ways. German speakers more likely to describe bridges as beautiful or elegant, using adjectives associated with femininity, because Brücke is feminine, while Spanish speakers might use adjectives associated with masculinity, because puente is masculine, the grammatical category bleeding into conceptual association, into aesthetics judgment, and this is just one example, one small way that linguistic structure might shape cognition. There are thousands of such potential influences, thousands of ways that the particular language we speak might guide our attention, might make certain distinctions easy and others difficult, might provide ready-made categories for some experiences while leaving others unnamed. The Piraha language of the Amazon, described by linguist Daniel Everett, reportedly has no number words beyond 1 and 2, no way to talk about specific quantities. And Piraha speakers perform differently on certain numerical tasks than speakers of languages with elaborate number systems, though debate continues about how to interpret these differences, about whether they reflect linguistic constraint or cultural emphasis, about whether language determines thought or merely facilitates it. Color terms vary dramatically across languages, some languages having dozens of basic color words, others having only 2 or 3, and while there seem to be universal tendencies, certain colors like red and blue emerging as basic terms across many languages, the boundaries between colors, where blue becomes green or green becomes yellow, these vary, and speakers of different languages show subtle differences in color perception, in how quickly they can categorize borderline shades, suggesting that language doesn't determine what we can see, but influences how readily we see it. The question of linguistic relativity, of how language shapes thought, remains one of the most fascinating and contentious in all of linguistics, because it touches on fundamental issues of human nature, on whether we all share a common cognitive foundation or whether our minds are sculpted by the particular languages we speak, whether translation is possible because thoughts are universal, or whether something is always lost, always untranslatable, because concepts are language specific. And the answer seems to be, as with so many things, somewhere in between, that there are universal aspects of cognition, constraints imposed by our shared biology, by the structure of perception, by basic needs and experiences that all humans share, but that within these constraints, language provides frameworks, not templates, habitual ways of thinking that differ across communities, that shape but don't determine, that influence but don't imprison. Every language is both a window and a lens, showing us the world, but also coloring how we see it, offering certain perspectives while making others harder to access. And learning a new language isn't just acquiring new words for old concepts, but sometimes acquiring new concepts, new ways of cutting up reality, new dimensions of experience that your first language didn't name. The Japanese concept of ma, the meaningful interval, the space between things, or the Danish hygge, that sense of cozy contentment, or the Portuguese saudade, a melancholic longing for something absent. These aren't just untranslatable words. They are culturally specific ways of attending to experience, of marking certain feelings or situations as meaningful, as worthy of linguistic encoding. And when you learn these words, when you begin to use them, you don't just add to your vocabulary, you add to your emotional repertoire. You begin to notice the thing the word names, to feel it as a distinct experience rather than just a vague, unnamed sensation, language teaching you not just how to speak, but how to feel, how to perceive, how to be in the world. This is perhaps the deepest gift of linguistic diversity, not just that it provides multiple ways to say the same thing, but that it reveals multiple ways to experience reality, multiple valid perspectives on what matters, on what's worth distinguishing, on how to organize the blooming, buzzing confusion of existence into meaningful categories. And as languages disappear, as communities shift to dominant languages under economic and political pressure, we lose more than words. We lose these perspectives, these ways of being human, these experiments in meaning that evolved over thousands of years, shaped by particular landscapes and histories and needs. The night around these thoughts grows deeper, quieter, and I find myself thinking about the first utterances, the first moments when human vocal cords shaped themselves around intention, when sound became more than expression, became symbol, became reference, became the foundation of everything that would follow. We'll never know exactly how it happened, that transition from animal communication to human language, but we can imagine the slow accumulation of innovations, the first use of a consistent sound to mean a specific thing, the first combination of sounds to create new meaning, the first grammatical patterns emerging from repeated use, the way complexity built on complexity, each generation adding to what they inherited, until language became this magnificent edifice we now inhabit. And every child recapitulates this journey in compressed form, moving from cries and coos to babbling, from babbling to first words, from first words to explosions of meaning, building in months and years what took the species millennia, guided by innate capacities, yes, but also by the patient scaffolding of caregivers, by the linguistic community welcoming them into shared understanding. There's something almost sacred about this transmission, this passing of language from generation to generation. Each child a new beginning, a fresh instantiation of the human capacity for meaning, and each language community a living tradition, maintaining and transforming and handing forward this precious inheritance. The world has gone very quiet now, or perhaps I've just stopped hearing anything but the sound of words forming, of meanings emerging, of this strange loop where language thinks about language, where the tool examines itself, where we use the very capacity we're trying to understand to try to understand it. And maybe that's fitting. Maybe that's the only way it could be, because language isn't something we have like a possession, like a tool we pick up and put down. It's something we are. It's woven into the fabric of human consciousness, into how we remember and plan and dream, into the very structure of thought itself. As I let these reflections settle, as the need for words begins to fade, I'm left with a sense of gratitude for this capacity we share, for the millions of years of evolution that made it possible, for the thousands of years of cultural development that shaped it, for the communities that maintain it, for the individuals who study it, trying to understand this most human of human gifts. Language asks nothing of us except that we use it, that we speak and listen, that we read and write, that we pass it on, and in return, it gives us everything, gives us the ability to share our inner lives, to build on the knowledge of the past, to imagine futures that don't yet exist, to create art and science and philosophy and jokes and stories and all the endless variety of human expression. The silence that surrounds these final words feels different now, not empty but full of all the possible utterances, all the things that could be said, all the languages that could say them, a silence pregnant with meaning, with the potential for speech, for connection, for understanding. And perhaps this is where we should rest, in this quiet appreciation, this recognition of language as both ordinary miracle and miraculous ordinance, something so familiar we forget to notice it, something so extraordinary it defies complete explanation, something we do, something we are, something that makes us human. The night holds this knowledge gently, the way it holds all knowledge, without grasping, without demanding, just present, just there, like language itself, like the capacity for meaning, like the long history of humans trying to understand their own voices, their own words, their own endless creative impulse to speak, to share, to mean. And in the growing stillness, in the space between thoughts, in the quiet that needs no words, there's just this, the simple fact of language, existing, persisting, connecting us across time and space, linking mind to mind, building bridges of understanding, constructing the shared world we all inhabit. The words fade now, not into nothing, but into everything, into the vast ocean of language that surrounds us, that we swim through, that we breathe, that carries us, generation after generation, forward into whatever comes next, whatever new forms language will take, whatever new meanings humans will create, whatever new ways we'll find to say what needs saying, to share what needs sharing, to be together in understanding. I stand at the edge of the water where two worlds meet, where the land narrows and the sea whispers through a passage that has witnessed empires rise and fall like tides. The strait before me shimmers in light that seems to belong to no single hour, neither dawn nor dusk, but something eternal, something that exists outside the usual measure of days. The water moves in currents that have flowed for longer than memory, longer than any story written in stone or parchment, and on the far shore, barely a breath away across this narrow throat of sea, another continent waits in the golden haze. This is the place where Europe ends and Asia begins, or perhaps where Asia ends and Europe begins, for the answer changes depending on which shore you stand upon, which direction you face as the light changes and the gulls wheel overhead in their endless patterns. The city that grew here, in this impossible location, this place of convergence, knew many names across the centuries, but each name carried the same essential truth, that geography is destiny, and this geography was unlike any other on earth. 7 hills rise from the peninsula, just as 7 hills once cradled Rome, but these hills stand guard over something Rome never possessed, the gateway between 2 seas, the crossing point between 2 continents, the hinge upon which so much of human story would turn. I imagine standing here 2,000 years ago, when the hills were less crowded, when the cypress trees grew thicker on the slopes, and the settlements were smaller, scattered, not yet dreaming of what they would become. The fishing villages along these shores could not have known, could not have imagined, the weight of history that would settle upon this peninsula like west layers of sediment, each century adding its own stratum of memory and stone. The water itself tells stories. The Bosphorus, narrow and swift, connects the Black Sea to the north with the Sea of Marmara to the south, and beyond that, through another strait, the Aegean and the wider Mediterranean. These waters were highways before roads, connections before empires, and the currents here run deep and strange, flowing in different directions at different depths, surface water moving one way, while the deeper currents pull another, as if the sea itself cannot decide which way to go, caught between north and south, between the landlocked darkness of the Euxine and the open Mediterranean sun. And there is another water here, an inlet that curves into the peninsula like a horn, or like an arm reaching inland to embrace the hills. The Golden Horn, they called it, and the name feels right even now, for when the light catches it at certain angles, the water gleams with a warmth that seems almost metallic, almost precious. This natural harbor, deep and protected, offered anchorage to countless vessels across the ages. Phoenician traders and Greek triremes, Roman grain ships and medieval cogs, galleys flying banners in languages that have since fallen silent. The Greeks came early to these shores, settlers from Megara, looking for new lands, new harbors, new opportunities in a world that seemed infinite with possibility. They founded a colony here, gave it a name, built their temples and their walls, not knowing they were planting seeds that would grow into something far beyond their imagining. Their city was modest, practical, taking advantage of the natural defenses, the water on 3 sides, the hills providing elevation and vision, but the location, the location whispered promises that could not be ignored forever. I think of the generals and emperors who stood where I stand now, who looked across these waters and understood what this place could mean. The strait is so narrow here that you can see faces on the opposite shore when the light is clear, can watch the smoke rising from cooking fires, can almost hear voices carried across the water when the wind is right. To control this crossing, to command this passage, was to hold the throat of the world's trade, the pulse point of empire. Centuries rolled past like the tides. The Greek colony grew, persisted, endured invasions and sieges, rebuilt itself after fires and earthquakes. The hills gradually filled with structures, temples honoring gods whose names we still remember, Zeus and Poseidon, Apollo and Artemis. The harbor welcomed ships from distant ports, carrying grain and wine, olive oil and purple dye, timber from the Black Sea forests and amber from the Baltic shores. And then came a moment, a decision, a recognition of destiny that would change everything. An emperor, battle, weary and calculating, stood at a crossroads of his own. Rome, ancient Rome, the eternal city of 7 hills beside the Tiber, was no longer the center it had been. The empire had grown too vast, too unwieldy. Its frontiers stretched too thin across deserts and forests. The threats came from every direction now, and Rome, for all its glory, sat in the wrong place, too far west, too distant from the wealthy eastern provinces, too removed from the frontiers that needed constant defense. He needed a new capital, a new Rome, a place that could command the empire's resources, could watch over its most valuable territories, could project power in all the directions that mattered most. And so his eyes turned here, to this peninsula, this crossing, this place where the waters meet and the continents touch. Here, he saw, was the location that could anchor a new age. The decision, once made, set in motion transformations that would echo across 1,000 years. The transformation began in the year 324, when Constantine, the emperor who had reunited a fractured empire through force of arms and will, chose this ancient Greek settlement as the site for his new capital. He had considered other locations: Thessaloniki, Troy, even Jerusalem, but none possessed the strategic perfection of this peninsula. None commanded the waterways with such absolute authority. He arrived with architects and engineers, with priests and bureaucrats, with soldiers and laborers numbering in the tens of thousands. The modest city that had existed here, known as Byzantium for the centuries since its Greek founding, would be erased and reborn, expanded beyond anything its original settlers could have conceived. The emperor himself, according to the stories that survived, walked the boundaries of his new city, marking out walls that would encompass 7 hills in deliberate echo of Rome. He walked for miles, far beyond the existing settlement, and when his advisors questioned the enormous circuit he was tracing, he replied that he followed an invisible guide, a divine presence that showed him the true extent of what this place must become. Whether the story is true or legend hardly matters, for the ambition was real enough, and the construction that followed was staggering in its scope. Walls began to rise, massive fortifications of stone and brick, circuits within circuits, protecting a city that did not yet exist, but soon would. The old Greek Acropolis was incorporated into the new design, but everything expanded outward and upward, spreading across hills that were leveled and valleys that were filled. The natural topography was respected where it served the plan, reshaped where it did not. The harbor of the Golden Horn became the commercial heart, its shores lined with warehouses and docks, quays built to handle the traffic of an empire. Across the peninsula, facing the Sea of Marmara, other harbors took shape, artificial basins carved and walled, creating protected anchorages for the imperial fleet, for the grain ships that would feed the growing population, for the merchant vessels that would make this city the crossroads of trade between east and west, north and south. Constantine demanded magnificence, and magnificence required spoliation. The empire was scoured for treasures to adorn the new capital. Columns were taken from temples in Athens and Ephesus. Statues were removed from their pedestals in Alexandria and Antioch. Obelisks that had stood in Egypt for millennia were transported across the sea, dragged up the hills, erected in the new forums and squares, the bronze horses of Chios, the serpent column from Delphi, the statue of Apollo from Phrygia. All were relocated. All became part of this manufactured glory. Churches rose on the hills, for Constantine had embraced Christianity, had seen in it the unifying force his empire needed. The Church of the Holy Apostles was built to house relics of the faith and eventually to serve as the emperor's own tomb. The first iteration of what would later become the Great Hagia Sophia took shape, a basilica dedicated to holy wisdom, divine wisdom, though the building Constantine knew would not survive the centuries ahead. A hippodrome was constructed, vaster than any arena Rome possessed, seating capacity measured in the tens of thousands. Its central spine was decorated with the plundered monuments, the Egyptian obelisk, the serpent column, the masonry obelisk built from stone blocks and once covered in bronze plates. Here the citizens would gather, not just for chariot races, but for imperial ceremonies, for political demonstrations, for the communal expression of loyalty or discontent. The city was officially dedicated on the 11th of May. In the year 330, Constantine proclaimed it Nova Roma, New Rome, but the people had their own name for it, a name that honored the emperor who had created it from ambition and stone. They called it Constantinople, Constantine's city, and that name would endure for more than 1,000 years. The population grew with startling speed. Settlers were encouraged with grants of free grain, with land, with the promise of opportunity in this new center of power. Noble families from old Rome were persuaded to build palaces here, bringing their wealth and their influence. The Senate was duplicated, creating a second deliberative body to mirror the one in Rome, though both would gradually lose power to the imperial throne. Within a generation, Constantinople had become what Constantine intended, a true capital, perhaps more vital than Rome itself. The eastern provinces of the empire, wealthy Egypt and Syria, prosperous Asia Minor and Greece, now had their administrative center close at hand. The emperor could respond quickly to threats on the Persian frontier, could manage the Danube defenses with greater efficiency, could tap the wealth of the East without the delay of communicating across the Mediterranean. The location proved its worth again and again. When threats came from the north, from migrating peoples pushing against the Danube frontier, the city's position allowed rapid deployment of forces. When Persian armies invaded the eastern provinces, Constantinople served as the secure base from which countermeasures could be organized. The walls, already formidable, could be supplied by sea even if land routes were cut. The city could never be easily starved, never truly isolated as long as the navy controlled the waters. But the transformation was not merely strategic. It was cultural, spiritual. The city became the showcase for a new Christian empire. The old gods were not yet entirely forgotten. The classical traditions still commanded respect, but increasingly, the identity of Constantinople was bound up with the Church, with Orthodox Christianity as it was developing in the Greek-speaking East. Councils were held here, bishops gathering to debate the nature of Christ, the relationship between Father and Son, the precise theological formulations that would define faith for millions. These debates were not abstract. They mattered intensely to emperors and citizens alike. Riots could erupt over doctrinal disputes. Factions formed around competing interpretations. The city's religious character shaped its politics, and its politics shaped the empire's religious direction. The 5th century brought challenges that tested everything Constantine had built. The Western Roman Empire, Old Rome and its territories, began its long collapse. Waves of migrating peoples, Goths and Vandals, Huns and Burgundians, carved kingdoms from what had been Roman provinces. The city of Rome itself was sacked, first in 410 by Visigoths, then again in 455 by Vandals. The unthinkable had happened. The eternal city had fallen, but Constantinople endured. Its walls held against attacks. Its position allowed it to survive where Rome could not. The emperors in Constantinople still called themselves Roman, still claimed authority over the lost western provinces, but increasingly they ruled only the East, Greece and Thrace, Asia Minor and the Levant, Egypt and parts of North Africa. This was still a formidable realm, wealthy and populous, but it was no longer the universal empire that Constantine had known. The Greek language, always dominant in the eastern provinces, became even more central to the imperial administration. Latin persisted in law and the military, in titles and official documents. But the everyday language of Constantinople was Greek, the language of its markets and monasteries, its schools and streets. The city was becoming something distinct, neither quite the new Rome that Constantine had proclaimed, nor simply a Greek city-state, but a synthesis, a civilization taking shape at the crossroads. The reign of Justinian, beginning in 527, marked both a pinnacle and a transformation. This emperor dreamed of reconquest, of restoring the empire to its former extent. His generals, Belisarius and Narses, led campaigns that reclaimed North Africa from the Vandals, Italy from the Ostrogoths, parts of Spain from the Visigoths. For a brief moment, the Mediterranean seemed Roman again, the old empire seemingly restored, but Justinian's legacy to Constantinople itself was even more profound. In 532, riots erupted in the Hippodrome. Factions supporting the blue and green chariot racing teams turned their rivalry into armed rebellion. The Nika riots, named for the victory cry that united the factions, nearly toppled Justinian from his throne. Half the city burned, including the great church, the Hagia Sophia that Constantine had built. Justinian, persuaded by his Empress Theodora to stand firm rather than flee, crushed the rebellion with horrifying violence. Tens of thousands died in the Hippodrome, where imperial troops trapped the rioters. The city lay in ruins, devastated by fire and blood. And from those ruins, Justinian built something unprecedented. The new Hagia Sophia rose in just 5 years, a span of time that seems impossible given the ambition of what was created. Justinian assembled the finest architects, Anthemios of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus, mathematicians as much as builders, men who understood geometry in ways that allowed them to conceive structures that defied conventional limits. The building they designed was unlike anything that had come before. Its central dome, spanning more than 100 feet across, seemed to float above the vast interior space with no visible means of support. Light poured in through windows ringing the dome's base, creating the illusion that the great hemisphere rested on a circle of light itself, on something immaterial and divine. The interior glowed with marble brought from quarries across the empire, green stone from Thessaly, purple porphyry from Egypt, white marble from the islands, yellow stone from Syria. The columns, salvaged from temples older than Christianity, supported galleries where empresses and noblewomen would observe the liturgy. The floor, patterned in geometric complexity, reflected the light from thousands of oil lamps and candles that burned during services. Gold covered the ceiling vaults, mosaic work that caught and multiplied the flickering light, creating an atmosphere that witnesses described as otherworldly, as if stepping from the streets of Constantinople into a realm that existed halfway between earth and heaven. When Justinian first entered the completed church, he is said to have whispered, "Solomon, I have surpassed you," comparing his creation to the legendary temple in Jerusalem. The building became the heart of the empire's spiritual life. Here emperors were crowned. Here the Patriarch of Constantinople led liturgies attended by thousands. Here the greatest occasions of state and faith unfolded beneath that impossible dome. The church represented everything Constantinople had become, a fusion of classical engineering and Christian devotion, a statement of permanence and divine favor, a monument that declared this city to be the center of the world. But the 6th century brought darkness along with glory. Plague arrived in 541, the first pandemic of what would later be called Justinian's plague, a disease that may have been bubonic, carried by rats and fleas from Egypt or beyond. It swept through the densely packed neighborhoods, through the tenements and palaces alike. Contemporary accounts describe wagons piled with corpses, mass graves dug outside the walls when the traditional burial grounds overflowed, towers filled with the dead when even the graves ran out. The population, which may have reached 500,000 at its peak, was decimated. The word is used precisely here, not merely reduced, but cut by ratios that left entire districts empty, entire professions without practitioners. The economic life of the city stumbled. Tax revenues collapsed. The ambitious building projects slowed or stopped entirely. Yet Constantinople survived, as it had survived riots and sieges, as it would survive challenges yet to come. The plague recurred in waves over the following centuries, but the city's position, its walls, its access to grain from Egypt and later from the Black Sea regions allowed it to endure where other cities might have collapsed entirely. The 7th century brought new threats, more existential than any before. The Persian Empire, revived under the Sassanid dynasty, launched devastating invasions into the eastern provinces. Jerusalem fell. The true cross was carried away to Persia. Egypt was conquered, the empire's wealthiest province lost. Persian armies reached the shores of the Bosphorus itself, camping within sight of Constantinople's walls. The city seemed on the verge of final catastrophe. Emperor Heraclius, desperate and determined, led an audacious campaign deep into Persian territory, turning defense into counterattack. His victories, won far from Constantinople in the mountains and valleys of Anatolia and beyond, destroyed the Sassanid military power, recovered the lost provinces, brought the true cross back to Jerusalem in triumph. For a moment, it seemed the empire had survived its greatest test, but even as Heraclius celebrated, a new force was rising in the deserts of Arabia. The followers of Muhammad, united by a new faith and driven by religious and imperial zeal, erupted from the peninsula. Syria fell to the Arab armies, then Palestine, then Egypt. Within a single generation, more than half the empire was lost, this time permanently. The wealthy provinces that had sustained Constantinople for centuries, that had fed its population and filled its treasuries, were gone. The empire contracted, becoming essentially a Greek kingdom centered on Constantinople and controlling Asia Minor, parts of Greece and the Balkans, scattered islands and coastal territories. The loss of Egypt was particularly devastating. Alexandria had been the empire's second city, and Egyptian grain had fed Constantinople's multitudes. New sources had to be found, new trade routes established, new agricultural regions developed in Thrace and around the Black Sea. The character of the empire changed. It became more thoroughly Greek in language and culture, more intensely focused on Orthodox Christianity as its defining identity. The elaborate bureaucracy adapted. The military reorganized into themes. Provincial districts where soldier farmers held land in exchange for military service. The classical heritage persisted in education and literature, but it was filtered increasingly through Christian interpretation, through monastic preservation, through a culture that saw itself as the guardian of true faith in a world threatened by heresies and infidels. Constantinople itself remained magnificent despite the reduced circumstances of the empire it governed. The walls, expanded and strengthened in the 5th century by the emperors Theodosius II, formed a triple line of fortifications across the landward approach, massive barriers studded with towers, fronted by a moat that could be flooded from cisterns within the city. No enemy could hope to breach these defenses with the siege technology of the age. The Arab caliphates tried repeatedly, sending armies and fleets to blockade the city by land and sea, but the walls held, and Greek fire, an incendiary weapon whose formula was a closely guarded secret, destroyed the Arab fleets in the waters around the city. The 8th and 9th centuries brought internal convulsions over theology. The iconoclast controversy erupted when emperors, influenced by concerns that the veneration of religious images bordered on idolatry, ordered the destruction of icons throughout the empire. Mosaics were covered with plaster, paintings destroyed, statues broken. The dispute raged for more than a century, tearing the church and the empire into factions, pitting emperors against patriarchs, monks against soldiers, East against West. Constantinople became a battleground of theology. Monasteries that refused to surrender their icons were persecuted. Defenders of images were exiled, or worse. But the iconophile position, the defense of sacred images, eventually prevailed. The triumph of orthodoxy in 843 restored the icons, and restored also a sense of unity to the empire's religious life. The controversy had pushed the empire further from the Latin West, where the Pope had condemned iconoclasm, deepening divisions that would eventually become an unbridgeable schism. Through all these centuries, the physical city continued to evolve. Aqueducts brought water from distant sources, feeding enormous underground cisterns, vast chambers supported by forests of columns, where water reserves enough to survive long sieges accumulated in cool darkness. The basilica cistern, with its hundreds of columns salvaged from classical buildings, its Medusa head column bases lying sideways in the water, was only the largest of many such constructions. The imperial palace complex sprawled across the southeastern point of the peninsula, a city within the city, halls and churches, barracks and treasuries, throne rooms decorated with mechanical wonders that impressed foreign ambassadors, golden trees where mechanical birds sang, thrones that could be raised toward the ceiling by hidden machinery, all designed to demonstrate the emperor's power and the empire's sophistication. The markets hummed with commerce from a world that extended far beyond the empire's shrunken borders. Silk from China arrived via the overland routes, furs from the north, amber and slaves from beyond the Black Sea, spices from India and the islands beyond. The city's artisans were renowned for their skill. Silk weaving had been introduced in Justinian's time, when monks smuggled silkworm eggs from China, breaking the Asian monopoly. Constantinople's silk became a luxury export, controlled by imperial monopoly, distributed as diplomatic gifts that carried prestige and obligation. The countryside around the city, across the waters in Asia, and around the coasts, was dotted with estates and monasteries, vineyards and olive groves, fishing villages that supplied the city's markets. In summer, the wealthy retreated to palaces along the Bosphorus shores, where sea breezes cooled the marble halls, where gardens descended in terraces to private harbors. The 10th and 11th centuries marked a resurgence, a period when the empire regained strength and Constantinople shone with renewed brilliance. Emperor Basil II, who reigned from 976 to 1025, expanded the frontiers through relentless campaigning. Bulgaria was conquered after decades of warfare. The Balkans brought securely under imperial control. Regions in the east were reclaimed from Arab emirs. The empire's borders reached extents not seen since before the Arab conquests, and wealth flowed once more into Constantinople's treasuries. The city became a destination for travelers from all directions. Merchants from Venice and Genoa established quarters along the Golden Horn. Russian traders brought furs and amber from the northern forests. Pilgrims passed through on their way to Jerusalem, stopping to marvel at the relics preserved in Constantinople's churches, the crown of thorns, fragments of the true cross, enough holy remains to fill entire catalogs. Visitors recorded their astonishment at the city's splendor. The Russian envoys sent by Prince Vladimir of Kiev in the late 10th century returned with tales of divine services in Hagia Sophia so magnificent they could not tell whether they were in heaven or on earth. Their report influenced Vladimir's decision to adopt Orthodox Christianity, binding Rus to Constantinople's religious and cultural sphere, creating connections that would shape Eastern Europe for centuries. But prosperity brought complacency, and the empire's military strength began to erode. The themes, those districts of soldier farmers, were gradually replaced by professional troops, mercenaries who fought for pay rather than land. The great landowning families accumulated power, building estates that rivaled imperial holdings. The delicate balance between emperor and aristocracy, between central authority and provincial magnates, began to tilt. In 1054, the simmering tensions between the Orthodox East and Catholic West finally erupted into formal schism. Disputes over theology, over the authority of the Pope versus the Patriarch, over the precise wording of the Creed, led to mutual excommunications. The Christian world split definitively. Rome and Constantinople, once united under a single empire, now represented separate and competing traditions. The break was partly theological, partly political, partly cultural, a recognition that East and West had been drifting apart for centuries, and the final severance merely acknowledged reality. 17 years later, disaster struck from an unexpected direction. The Seljuk Turks, nomadic warriors who had converted to Islam and carved out a sultanate in Persia, invaded Asia Minor at Manzikert in 1071. They destroyed a Byzantine army and captured the Emperor Romanos IV. The defeat was catastrophic, not merely for the loss of troops, but for what followed. Asia Minor, the heartland that had sustained the empire since the loss of Egypt and Syria, dissolved into chaos. Turkish warbands raided at will. Local strongmen declared independence within a decade. Most of Anatolia was lost. Constantinople itself was not directly threatened. The walls still stood impregnable, but the empire's strategic position had fundamentally weakened. The city that had once commanded provinces from the Atlantic to Mesopotamia now controlled little beyond Thrace, parts of Greece, and scattered coastal territories. The population of the capital itself may have declined to fewer than half the number who had lived there in Justinian's day. The emperors turned to the west for help. Emperor Alexios I, facing Turkish pressure and Norman aggression in the Balkans, sent appeals to the Pope, asking for mercenary troops to help recover lost territories. The response exceeded anything he had imagined or desired. In 1096, Pope Urban II preached the First Crusade, calling on Western knights to march to Jerusalem's rescue, to win back the Holy Land from Muslim rule. The Crusaders who arrived in Constantinople were unlike any allies the empire had dealt with before. Frankish knights, Norman adventurers, German nobles, they came in their tens of thousands, armored and hungry, pious and greedy in equal measure. Alexios managed to extract oaths of loyalty, promises to return conquered lands to imperial control. But the cultural gulf between the Greeks of Constantinople and these Latin warriors was vast, mutual incomprehension shading into mutual contempt. The Crusades brought temporary benefits. Some lost territories were recovered. Buffer states were established in Syria and Palestine, but they also brought complications that would prove disastrous. Italian city-states, Venice and Genoa especially, demanded trading privileges in exchange for naval support. Their merchant quarters in Constantinople grew into autonomous colonies, controlling larger shares of the city's commerce, undermining the empire's economic independence. The wealth remained visible. The palaces still gleamed with marble and mosaic. The churches still held their treasures. The markets still offered luxuries from across the known world. But the underlying strength was ebbing. The empire was being hollowed out, its provinces lost or alienated, its military power dependent on mercenaries, its economy increasingly dominated by foreign merchants. The 12th century saw Constantinople at its most cosmopolitan and most vulnerable. The city's population was a mixture of Greeks and Armenians, Slavs and Italians, Jews and Arabs, speaking a cacophony of languages, following different rites and customs. The Venetian quarter alone housed thousands of Latin merchants with their own churches and laws. The Genoese had their enclave, Pisans another. Each Italian city competed for imperial favor, for better terms, for greater privileges. Emperor Manuel I, reigning from 1143 to 1180, tried to restore imperial prestige through grand gestures. He campaigned in Italy, negotiated with the Pope about reuniting the churches, held tournaments in Western style to impress visiting crusaders. His court was magnificent, but the displays masked continuing decline. When he died, the empire fragmented into factions, civil wars, coups and counter-coups that weakened central authority. In 1182, riots erupted against the Latin merchants, resentment at their wealth and privileges, at their control of commerce, at their arrogance, boiled over into violence. The Venetian and Genoese quarters were attacked, merchants were killed, properties looted. The massacre poisoned relations with the Italian states, created enmities that would soon bear bitter fruit. The Fourth Crusade was supposed to march to Egypt, to strike at Muslim power at its source. Instead, diverted by Venetian interests and Byzantine dynastic disputes, the Crusader army arrived at Constantinople in 1203. They came ostensibly to restore a deposed emperor, but when the political situation in the city grew complicated, when promised payments were not delivered, the Crusaders turned on Constantinople itself. In April of 1204, Western Christian warriors stormed the walls of the greatest Christian city in the world. What followed was catastrophe beyond measure. For 3 days, the Crusaders sacked Constantinople. Churches were stripped of their treasures, icons pried from walls, relics scattered or stolen. The bronze horses of the Hippodrome were taken to Venice, where they still stand. Libraries burned. Manuscripts that preserved classical texts were lost forever. Women were violated. Citizens killed regardless of age. The city that had stood unconquered for 9 centuries, that had repelled countless sieges by enemies of every description, fell to an army that marched under Christian banners. The Crusaders established a Latin empire in Constantinople, parceling out the Byzantine territories among Frankish nobles. The great city became a shabby imitation of itself, stripped of wealth, depopulated, its glory vandalized. The Venetians took the best relics and treasures back to Italy, the finest horses, the most precious manuscripts, the holiest relics, all disappeared into Western collections. Byzantine remnants survived in exile, Greek emperors ruling from Nicaea in Asia Minor, from Trebizond on the Black Sea coast, preserving the tradition, keeping alive the claim to legitimate rule for 57 years. Constantinople languished under Latin occupation. Its population declined, its monuments crumbled, its role as a center of civilization diminished. In 1261, Michael VIII Palaeologos, ruling from Nicaea, recaptured Constantinople through a combination of diplomacy and opportunistic assault. The Latin garrison was undermined, the defenses weak, and the city returned to Greek rule, but what was recovered was a shadow. The empire that resumed was impoverished, controlling little territory, facing threats from all sides. The Ottomans, a Turkish people who had established themselves in northwestern Anatolia, were beginning their expansion, taking Byzantine cities one by one, gradually encircling what remained. Constantinople was restored as best the limited resources allowed. Churches were repaired, the palace complex partially rebuilt, intellectual life revived as scholars gathered once more in the ancient capital. The 14th century saw a flowering of art and theology, of philosophical debate and literary production, a final renaissance of Byzantine culture, even as the empire's political and military situation deteriorated beyond recovery. The city's population continued to shrink. Perhaps 40,000 lived within walls built to shelter 500,000. Whole districts lay abandoned. Fields and vineyards grew within the ancient circuits. The great forums were quiet, the hippodrome unused. The emperors could barely afford to maintain the essential fortifications, let alone restore the city to its former magnificence. Yet Constantinople remained a symbol. The emperors, however weak, still carried the prestige of Roman legitimacy, still claimed descent from Augustus and Constantine. The patriarch still led the Orthodox Church, still commanded spiritual allegiance across Eastern Europe and beyond. The city's libraries, though diminished, still preserved texts unknown in the West. Byzantine scholars would carry this learning to Italy, contributing to the Renaissance that was beginning to stir. The Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed II, barely into his 20s but possessed of an ambition that matched the city he desired, assembled an army of unprecedented size in the spring of 1453, perhaps 80,000 soldiers, perhaps more. The chronicles disagree on numbers but concur on the overwhelming disparity. Constantinople could muster fewer than 7,000 defenders, citizens and foreign volunteers, Genoese and Venetian sailors, a handful of knights against a force that surrounded the land walls like a tide. The siege began in early April. The Ottomans brought technology that previous besiegers had lacked. Massive cannon, cast specially for this assault, fired stone balls weighing over half a ton. The walls that had stood for 1,000 years, that had turned back every assault, now shuddered under bombardment of unprecedented intensity. Day after day, the great guns roared, slowly battering breaches in the ancient fortifications. The defenders worked through the nights, repairing breaches with timber and rubble, anything to plug the gaps. The Emperor Constantine XI, last of the Roman emperors, fought alongside his men, refusing offers of escape, choosing to die with his city, if die it must. The patriarch led prayers in Hagia Sophia. The great church filled night after night with liturgies for deliverance that would not come. On the 29th of May, after nearly 2 months of siege, the final assault began before dawn. Wave after wave of Ottoman troops threw themselves at the walls. The defenders, exhausted and depleted, held through the initial attacks, but the relentless pressure found weaknesses. A small gate, the Kirkaporta, had been left unlocked. A handful of Ottoman soldiers found it, got inside the walls, raised their banners on the ramparts. The sight of enemy flags inside the defenses broke the defense. Sections of wall were abandoned. Defenders fled or were overwhelmed. The Ottomans poured through breaches and over walls, flooding into streets they had dreamed of conquering. Constantine XI died fighting, his body lost among the thousands of dead. Whether he fell on the walls or in the streets, no one could say with certainty. The sack that followed was thorough but organized. Mehmed had promised his troops the customary 3 days of plunder, and the soldiers took what they wanted. But the Sultan also moved quickly to establish order, to preserve what he intended to make his own capital. Hagia Sophia was converted into a mosque, the crosses removed, minarets eventually added, but the great building itself was preserved, its mosaics plastered over rather than destroyed. The name began to change gradually at first. The city had been Istanbul, in common Turkish speech even before the conquest, a corruption of the Greek phrase Eistinpolin, meaning to the city. After 1453, this informal name became official, though Constantinople persisted in Western usage for centuries. The transformation was not merely nominal. The Ottoman Empire made Istanbul its capital, pouring resources into restoration and expansion, bringing in Muslim settlers while allowing Greek and Armenian Christians to remain, creating a new cosmopolitan mixture. The dome of Hagia Sophia, which had survived earthquake and fire, iconoclasm, and crusader sack, now echoed with calls to prayer instead of Byzantine chant. The building that Justinian had built, that had been the heart of Orthodox Christianity for 9 centuries, became the model for Ottoman imperial mosques. Its dome inspired the architects of the Blue Mosque and the Suleimani, ensuring that Justinian's architectural vision continued to shape the city's skyline even under new rulers. Something profound shifts when we contemplate the span of time contained within this place. More than 2,000 years from the first Greek settlement to the Ottoman conquest, and another 500 years beyond that to our present moment. The layers accumulate, each civilization building upon or beside the ruins of what came before, each leaving traces that persist into our contemporary world. The city's geography remains unchanged. The Bosphorus still flows between Europe and Asia, still carries ships between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. The Golden Horn still curves into the peninsula, though its shores are lined now with bridges and highways rather than Byzantine warehouses. The 7 hills still rise, though the silhouette is different. Minarets where there were once bell towers, modern towers alongside Ottoman domes. Beneath the streets, the cisterns still hold water in their shadowed chambers. Tourists descend into the Basilica cistern, walk on platforms above the shallow pools. See the Medusa heads at the base of columns. Try to imagine the Byzantine engineers who created this space, who calculated the arches and the water flow, who salvaged those classical columns from buildings already ancient in their time. The walls still stand, or sections of them do, stretching across the modern city, interrupting traffic patterns, preserved as monuments to what they once protected. You can walk along portions of the Theodosian walls, touch stone laid 1,500 years ago, see where Ottoman cannonballs struck, where breaches were repaired, where history moved from potential to actual in moments of violence and decision. Hagia Sophia endures, though its purpose has shifted again, no longer mosque but museum, and now once more a mosque while remaining open to visitors. The building has outlasted empires, has served 3 religions, if we count its brief period as a Catholic cathedral during the Latin occupation. The dome still seems to float, still creates that sense of space transcending normal architectural limits. Justinian's boast was not empty. He did create something that has surpassed most human constructions in longevity and influence. The continuity is what strikes most deeply. This was not a city that rose and fell and was forgotten, buried under sand or reclaimed by jungle. It persisted, adapted, survived transformation after transformation while maintaining some essential character. Some thread connects the Greek colonists and the Byzantine emperors, the Ottoman sultans, and the modern citizens of Istanbul. All were shaped by this geography, this strategic position, this place where waters meet and continents almost touch. To study Constantinople is to study the entire sweep of Mediterranean and Near Eastern history. Every major power touched this city, Greeks and Romans, Persians and Arabs, Bulgars and Russians, Crusaders and Ottomans. Each left marks, contributed to the accumulation of culture and conflict that made the city what it was, what it is. The question of identity becomes complex here. Was it a Greek city, a Roman capital, a Christian citadel, an Ottoman metropolis? The answer shifts depending on the century. But perhaps the real answer is that it was all of these, that places with such long histories contain multitudes, hold contradictions without resolving them into simple narratives. Night falls over the water, and the city lights reflect in the Bosphorus, ships still passing through the strait as they have for millennia, though now they carry containers and oil rather than grain and silk. The minarets are illuminated. The bridges span the water in swooping arcs of steel and light. Ferries cross between continents in minutes, carrying commuters who barely register the strangeness of their daily transit between Europe and Asia. Somewhere beneath the modern streets, Byzantine mosaics wait undiscovered. Ottoman archives preserve documents and scripts few can now read. The layers go down and down, each excavation revealing earlier foundations, classical temples beneath Byzantine churches, beneath Ottoman mosques, beneath modern buildings. The archaeology of this place could continue for centuries and still not exhaust what lies buried. The name Istanbul has prevailed. Constantinople exists now mainly in history books and poetry, in the stories of what was and what passed away. But names are surface, and the place beneath the name persists, changes, and yet remains. The water still flows, the hills still rise, the strategic position still matters, even if modern geopolitics has shifted the calculus of power. I think of all who stood where I stand, who watched ships pass through this strait, who climbed these hills, who prayed in buildings now ruined or transformed. The continuity of place connects them across centuries that divide everything else. Constantine and Justinian, Mehmed and Suleiman, emperors and sultans, merchants and monks, soldiers and scholars, all knew these same waters, felt these same winds off the sea. The story does not end, cannot end, because the place continues. The city that was Byzantium and Constantinople, that became Istanbul and remains Istanbul, still exists at the crossroads, still watches over the water, still accumulates history with each passing year. The layers deepen, the complexity increases, and somewhere in that accumulation, in that refusal to be reduced to a single narrative, lies something essential about human civilization itself. How we build, how we endure, how we transform and yet carry forward elements of what we were. The city shows us this in stone and water, in walls that stand and domes that shelter prayers, in languages the builders never imagined, in streets walked by pilgrims and tourists, conquerors and exiles, in the endless flow of the Bosphorus connecting seas and epochs. The light fades now over the water, and the details blur into silhouette. The specifics of dynasty and doctrine, of siege and treaty, of rise and fall, all settle into the larger pattern, a place at the edge, a threshold, a crossing point where the world meets itself, where East encounters West, where Europe touches Asia, where past flows into present, like the current flows from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. And in the gathering darkness, as the city lights brighten against the night, the sense of duration becomes almost palpable. 2,000 years, 50 generations, 100 emperors and sultans, countless millions who lived and died within these walls or passed through on their way to somewhere else, all of it compressed into this geography, this peninsula, this crossing, this place that has witnessed more of human story than perhaps any other spot on earth. The water keeps moving, patient and persistent, wearing at stone, reflecting light, connecting distant shores. It was here before the first settlements, and it will remain long after our current moment becomes another layer in the endless accumulation. The city changes, the empires rise and fall, but the strait continues. The crossing endures. The place persists.